Hi guys. Tonight we drift together through a moonlit world of stone and silence. The air smells faintly of wet limestone and ancient smoke. Your footsteps echo softly as you pass under a low archway, the kind that forces you to bow whether you mean to or not. Above, the stars hang steady, but the walls around you seem alive, breathing with memories. For a moment you imagine what it must have been like to live here, to feel safe inside these towers, and then you realize, with a little grin, that you probably wouldn't survive this century for more than a week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from, so post your location and local time down in the comments. Now, dim the lights. You begin to walk deeper into the castle grounds, guided only by a flickering torch that spits tiny embers into the cold air. The first thing you notice isn't grandeur, it's weight. Every block of stone hums faintly with centuries of weather, with rain that's come and gone 1,000 times. These walls were built to endure, not to invite. Yet there's a strange comfort in their endurance, the way they stand like patient giants watching over the sleeping countryside. Castles began as desperate answers to chaos. After the fall of Rome, Europe splintered into feuding territories. Kings and knights needed places that could resist both arrow and ambition. The first castles were little more than wooden towers surrounded by ditches, crude, flammable, but easy to raise. It was only when Norman stonemasons took their chisels to the earth that castles transformed from fortifications into symbols. Stone was permanence. It said, "I am here to stay." You tilt your head and imagine the rhythm of a mason's hammer. Tap, pause, breathe. One historical fact whispers here. Many early stone keeps were built with limestone because it was soft enough to carve but hardened over time. An accidental genius of nature, slowly strengthening with each century. And then there's the quieter truth, the fringe sort of fact you don't hear in tourist brochures. Some lords salted the mortar with animal blood, believing it made the walls spiritually stronger. It's a detail that sits halfway between science and superstition, an echo of an age that never quite separated the sacred from the structural. Historians still debate whether that belief was widespread ritual or isolated madness, but it clings to the imagination like iron scent in the air. You keep walking. A breeze slips through the battlements, carrying the scent of moss and wood smoke from some faraway cottage. The landscape below is all hush-rolling hills, a dark forest line, perhaps a faint glimmer of a river. You think of how these fortresses were built as much for show as for defense. Every hilltop choice was deliberate, a signal to rivals. Look up and remember who commands this valley. Inside, the castle would have sounded alive even at night, metal scraping against stone as guards shifted their halberds, the mutter of servants finishing their chores, the soft snort of horses in the lower yard. You pass an arrow slit and look out. The world beyond seems impossibly distant, a sea of darkness dotted with faint village fires. Imagine being the watchman whose duty it was to stare into that blackness for hours, trying to guess whether the next spark meant danger. Your torchlight grazes carvings on the wall, rough initials, tiny crosses, crude faces, graffiti, centuries old. You trace one with your fingers and realize someone once stood here, perhaps bored or frightened, carving proof of their existence. It's small, almost tender. The stones remember everyone equally, from kings to kitchen boys. There's a gentle irony to these places. They were designed to keep people out, yet today they invite tourists in by the thousands. You smile at the thought somewhere in time. A lord would be appalled that you're wandering freely through his private courtyard, whispering about how cute the arrow loops look. Still, there's beauty here. Not the delicate kind, but the steadfast kind. You can feel it in the rhythm of the masonry, the symmetry of towers, the balance between defense and grace. The medieval mind loved order even in war. The square keep was not just practical. It represented stability in a world where loyalty changed with the weather. At your feet, the flagstones are uneven, worn to dips by countless souls. You think of the generations who walked this same route, the messenger sprinting with urgent news, the weary knight returning from campaign, the barefoot scullery girl carrying buckets before dawn. Each left a small trace, invisible but enduring. You pause near a narrow window where the moonlight pools like milk. It catches on your hand, and for an instant, you imagine that the stones themselves might be trying to whisper back something about endurance, maybe, or about the quiet dignity of being old and still standing. Then, in that dreamlike half moment, you think about how castles weren't only built to survive attack, they were built to survive time. Stone was memory in solid form, and while empires collapsed and languages shifted, these walls kept their silence. That silence is what you're hearing now, the slow exhale of a civilization long gone but never fully asleep. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the hum of the quarry, the creak of wooden scaffolds, the laughter of workers at midday. The construction of a castle could take decades, often spanning the lives of multiple generations. Imagine being born under a scaffold shadow, working your youth away, building a home you'd never live in, dying before the final tower rose. The patience of the Middle Ages is something modern hearts rarely understand. The torch sputters. A bat flutters overhead, a small shape darting through vaulted dark. You feel the air shift. Cooler now. Somewhere deep inside, a metal door clanks, perhaps the ghost of a portcullis in your imagination. The walls stand as they always have, holding both strength and sorrow. You take one last look at the courtyard, the shadows deepening like ink around every archway. The night feels older here. You realize the story of medieval castles isn't about war or royalty, it's about the slow heartbeat of stone and the fragile humans who once trusted it to keep them safe. And as you turn toward the keep's interior, stepping from moonlight into the first faint glow of torchlit corridors, the tale continues quietly under your breath, carried forward on a whisper that has waited centuries to be heard again. You move deeper into the castle, your steps echoing softly against flagstones slick with time. The air cools around you, damp and steady, the scent of age and moss thick enough to taste. Here beneath your boots lies the true story of castles, the secret logic of where and why they were born. You are walking not just over stones, but over centuries of ambition. A castle's power began at its foundations. Medieval builders were practical dreamers, artists who understood mud and mountain as well as they understood faith. The choice of a site was everything. Some lords built on lonely hilltops, where the ground was hard and visibility stretched for miles. Others chose river bends or cliff edges, where trade could be watched and taxed with a glance. The land decided the shape of the walls, the width of moats, even the mood of those who lived inside. You crouch to touch a foundation stone, its surface rough but alive with the memory of chisels. The main historical fact here is that many Norman castles were built on earlier Roman or Celtic sites. The conquerors reused sacred ground, claiming both the land and its legends. It was a kind of spiritual recycling, a message carved into the soil. We rule not just your bodies, but your ghosts. Then there is a curious rumor that feels half true, half story. Some builders supposedly buried animal bones or even tiny carvings of saints under cornerstones to bless the structure. A few whispered that unlucky workers were sealed alive inside, to ensure the walls never fell. Historians still argue whether these tales were ever more than fear-laced folklore, but it says something about how superstition and engineering once shared a heartbeat. You straighten, looking around. Every line of the castle begins to make sense now. The outer walls curve just slightly, following the contours of the hill. The towers face prevailing winds. The well sits exactly at the center, protected yet close to every corridor. Nothing about a castle was random. To survive in a medieval landscape was to think like both an architect and a strategist. Imagine being a surveyor with nothing but ropes, pegs, and your own patience. You would measure the horizon by eye, test soil by touch, and build geometry out of mud. A misplaced wall could mean ruin. Yet somehow, with tools no more advanced than wooden scaffolds and willpower. Entire fortresses rose straight from wilderness. You picture the builders, hunched in linen tunics, arguing over levels and weight. The sound of hammers blends with laughter, curses, and the creak of pulleys. Beneath their labor ran something invisible: belief. To build in stone was to challenge nature. You feel a little awe at the thought. Above you, a raven croaks, perched on a cracked parapet. The sound rings against the emptiness. You imagine this place when it was new, when banners snapped in the wind and everything smelled of fresh mortar and horse sweat. The ground must have quivered with energy then. The beauty of medieval construction lies in its contradictions. It was both mathematical and mystical. Builders followed sacred ratios, seeing harmony in the way a wall met a sky. They believed geometry echoed God's own design. A keep's proportions were not only structural but symbolic, aligning mortal hands with divine order. You wander toward what used to be the gatehouse, its archway half collapsed, ivy spilling through the cracks. The stones look heavy enough to outlast memory itself, and yet castles fell all the time. Sometimes to siege, more often to neglect. Their survival depended as much on politics as on architecture. A lord without heirs meant abandonment. A lost war meant ruin. You think of how many hands touched these same stones, and how quickly time replaces ownership. You kneel again, tracing a patch of stonework darker than the rest. Perhaps it was repaired after some forgotten skirmish, or perhaps it simply holds more moisture, a wound the rain never let heal. Every castle wall tells such quiet stories. You realize that the difference between a ruin and a relic is only a few centuries of patience. Somewhere in the distance, a bell would once have sounded from a chapel, marking time for the workers. The rhythm of prayer structured their days, even those who were too tired or cynical to care. Faith was the mortar between generations, as real as lime and sand. You picture the first night after the castle's completion. The Lord walks through the new halls with a torch, admiring his fortress, his legacy. He can finally sleep, knowing his enemies must climb, swim, and bleed to reach him. You wonder if he also feels the loneliness that comes with walls too thick for comfort. Safety and isolation share the same foundation. There's something soothing about that thought, oddly enough. Maybe that's why castles still fascinate people today. They embody both protection and prison, grandeur and claustrophobia. They are human contradictions turned to stone. You notice how quiet it has become. Even the wind seems to pause, as though listening. The night air presses close, damp and steady. You sit on a fallen block, letting your breathing slow to match the calm rhythm of the place. The torches that once lined the walls have long gone dark, yet the stones still hold a faint warmth, like memory refusing to fade. You realize now that to understand a castle is to understand its relationship with the land beneath it. The fortress is not imposed upon nature but born from it, carved and coaxed until it belongs. That's why ruins feel peaceful. They are returning to what they came from. As you stand to leave the courtyard, your foot brushes against a patch of wild thyme growing between the cracks. The scent rises instantly, sharp and clean, cutting through the musty air. You smile at the small rebellion of life among so much stone. Even in ruin, the earth keeps whispering back. The path leads you toward the inner ward, where moonlight catches the glint of still water ahead. Something stirs gently in the dark. The moat awaits, silent and shimmering. You walk toward it without hurry, ready to learn what secrets sleep beneath its mirrored surface. You follow the faint sound of rippling water, and soon the ground softens beneath your boots. The moonlight catches something ahead, a dark ribbon circling the walls like a patient guardian. You step closer, the torchlight reflecting off calm ripples, and there it is, the moat, wide, still, and more mysterious than any storybook ever dared to suggest. From a distance, moats look like decoration, but up close they smell of wet earth and algae, a living border between two worlds. Most people imagine they were meant for crocodiles or spikes, but the truth is quieter and cleverer. One well-documented detail from the period tells that moats were first designed simply to stop tunneling. When attackers tried to dig under a wall, the waterlogged soil would collapse, drowning both shovel and man. Practical, cold, and effective. But moats became more than tools of war. Over time, they turned into ecosystems, reservoirs, and even status symbols. According to contemporary accounts from France and England, lords stocked them with fish to feed their households during Lent. Carp, pike, and eels turned the defensive ditch into a private pantry. The water also cooled the air in summer, turning the inner courtyard into a small oasis of breeze and reflection. You crouch at the edge, the smell of damp stone mixing with moss and decay. Insects hum, and somewhere beneath the surface, a frog croaks as if in approval. There is a curious footnote from daily life that some castles dyed their moat water with chalk or even wine residue to make it shimmer during festivals. Imagine a crimson moat reflecting torchlight during a midsummer feast, transforming danger into spectacle. It is still uncertain among castle archaeologists whether the colour served a ritual purpose or simply amused the nobility, but the idea lingers like a rumour on the water's surface. History often blurs at the edges just like this reflection, bright and uncertain. You take a slow step along the bank, careful not to slip. The air feels thicker here, and the stone walls above you seem impossibly tall. You can almost picture guards leaning over the parapets watching your every move. A moat made an approach psychologically exhausting. To cross it meant exposing yourself to arrows, boiling oil, and shame if you slipped. Most attackers preferred to starve a castle out rather than swim for glory. Still, not all moats held water. Some were dry ditches filled with stakes or simply carved deep into bedrock. Their purpose was to break momentum, to turn a gallop into a crawl. The sight alone could sap courage. You imagine an army gathering on the far bank, drums beating, while defenders waited behind battlements sipping ale, pretending to be bored. That kind of waiting could stretch for weeks, both sides testing patience more than weapons. There's something strangely peaceful about this place now. Without soldiers, the moat has reverted to nature. Reeds sway gently, the wind carrying a soft hiss through their stalks. Fireflies blink like slow thoughts drifting over time. You realize how much of medieval life was shaped by the management of water. Wells, cisterns, and moats were lifelines as well as boundaries. Control the flow, and you controlled survival itself. One chronicler of the late 13th century mentioned that castles with clean moats were seen as reflections of a lord's soul. Filthy water meant negligence or moral decay. You chuckle quietly at the metaphor, imagining nobles ordering their servants to skim leaves from the surface to look pious. Then, there's another peculiar story you can't resist. Some accounts from Eastern Europe describe lords releasing swans or geese into the moat, both as decoration and as early alarm systems. The birds would hiss and honk at intruders, a feathery security detail. It sounds absurd, but anyone who has ever faced an angry goose knows the terror is real. You lean over the surface and catch your own reflection, broken by ripples. The moonlight paints you in silver, and for a moment, the centuries fold away. Imagine standing here 500 years ago, when this water might have carried the reflection of banners and armor instead of stars. It is easy to see why moats fascinated poets. They mirrored everything noble life aspired to be, serene on the surface, dangerous beneath. A sudden splash startles you, probably a frog or a fish, but your heart still jumps. You smile at yourself, realizing that even now the moat holds a quiet power to unsettle. Its beauty lies in contradiction. It invites and forbids at once. Some experts continue to dispute whether all moats were continuously filled with water. In many colder regions, they might have been drained seasonally or frozen solid, turning from barrier to playground. Children of the castle staff are said to have skated on them in winter, laughter echoing under the watchful eyes of stone towers. It is a comforting thought that even in places designed for defense, joy found its moment to slip in. You rise slowly and follow the curve of the wall, the soft squelch of damp soil beneath your boots marking time. The moat fades behind you, its surface returning to stillness, a mirror for whoever dares to look. Ahead lies the bridge, narrow and creaking, its chains faintly rattling in the breeze. The torchlight dances across the planks, leading you toward the heavy gate where shadows wait like old guards. The drawbridge may no longer move, but the thought of crossing it still feels sacred, like stepping between worlds. You take a deep breath of the cool night air, the smell of wet wood mixing with distant smoke, and begin your slow walk toward the gatehouse, where secrets of locks and iron await discovery. The gatehouse looms ahead of you, its silhouette sharp against the starlit sky. The closer you come, the more the air feels heavy with iron and oil, as if the ghosts of gears and chains still breathe somewhere within the stone. The wooden bridge beneath your feet creaks with a slow rhythm, each step echoing into the moat behind you. When you reach the threshold, you lift the torch and see the gates themselves. Massive oak doors, studded with black metal, scarred by centuries of wind and war. According to royal records from the early 12th century, these entrances were often the most expensive part of a castle. Every hinge, bolt, and chain had to be forged by hand. Blacksmiths were craftsmen of defense, their work both brutal and beautiful. If walls were the body of a fortress, the gates were its beating heart. You reach out to touch the iron lattice. The surface feels cool, a faint chill seeping into your fingertips. You can almost imagine the drawbridge creaking upward, chains rattling as it rises, water dripping below. In the medieval world, a functioning drawbridge was both a symbol of power and an act of theatre. A curious detail from an old castle inventory in Burgundy mentions that some lords had trumpeters sound a flourish every time their bridge was lowered, just to remind the village who controlled the threshold. The gatehouse was rarely quiet. Behind those doors stood guards who never truly slept, their armor clinking softly as they shifted through the night. Torches burned low, smoke curling up into blackened rafters. The smell here would have been a mix of oil, sweat, and animal fat from the lamps. You picture a young sentry leaning against a spear, humming softly to stay awake, his shadow stretching tall and thin across the wall. Many of these men were not soldiers by choice. They were farmers' sons, pressed into duty, promised meals and modest pay. They watched in silence as travelers approached, deciding who entered and who waited outside in the cold. To them, the gatehouse was both cage and stage. Archaeological evidence reveals that some castles built false gates to confuse attackers. The decoy doors led nowhere, designed to lure siege engines into traps or dead ends. The real entryway would often be hidden in a corner, angled so that invaders had to expose their right side, the unshielded one, as they tried to force their way in. It was defense disguised as invitation. A small but delightful oddity recorded in one surviving household roll describes a castle whose portcullis had tiny bells tied along its chains. The sound would jingle faintly every time it was lowered, like a mechanical warning or a metallic lullaby. You can almost hear it now, ringing softly in the darkness as if the gate were dreaming. The machinery of defense was precise and theatrical. Imagine standing inside the gate passage when danger came. The portcullis would drop with a roar, the iron teeth crashing into grooves cut in stone. Archers in the murder holes above would ready their bows, peering down through slits to fire on anyone trapped below. The drawbridge would slam shut, cutting off retreat. The noise would have been deafening, a mix of metal, shouts, and fear. Yet now, in the quiet night, the same space feels like a hollow throat waiting to whisper its story. Some scholars remain divided over how often such complex systems were actually used in combat. Many castles never faced real sieges at all. Their machinery served more to project power than to spill blood. Like armor polished for display, these gates performed intimidation as much as protection. You can sense that balance here, the blend of strength and showmanship that defined the age. You step beneath the archway, your torchlight painting orange waves across the stone. The ceiling curves above like the inside of a ribcage. Tiny holes pockmark the walls where beams once fit, the skeleton of a vanished portcullis. The smell of rust still lingers faintly, centuries old. You pause, listening. Only the wind answers, threading through cracks like a sigh. At your feet, the floor dips slightly, forming a shallow trough. This was once a defense channel where boiling water, tar, or even sand could be poured on intruders. It is strange to think how carefully death was engineered here, measured in inches and degrees. Yet the space feels more solemn than savage now, stripped of urgency, filled instead with memory. Beyond the gatehouse lies the inner yard, dimly lit by moonlight. You take one last look at the heavy doors. They seem to breathe, expanding and contracting with the night air. You imagine how many times they have opened and closed for messengers, pilgrims, soldiers, and thieves. Each visitor left a trace on the threshold, a fleeting echo in the castle's long pulse. One medieval account mentions that some castles installed hidden slots for sliding small gifts or bribes to guards without being seen. Perhaps a silver coin, a loaf of bread, or a letter folded tightly with wax. The gate was a place of negotiation as much as defense. You smile faintly at that thought. Even in a fortress, humanity finds a way to sneak in, disguised as generosity or deceit. The same hands that pulled chains of war might also accept tokens of friendship. The night has grown quieter now. The torches along the walls seem to lean towards sleep. Somewhere deep inside the keep, a single bell marks the hour, low and mournful. You step through the gate at last, leaving behind the weight of locks and levers. Ahead, the courtyard opens like a hidden garden waiting for dawn. The stone under your boots feels warmer here, softened by centuries of footsteps. The hum of daily life seems to stir faintly again. The clatter of pots, a distant laugh, the meow of a hungry cat. The mechanical defenses give way to something gentler, a rhythm of human comfort inside the cold geometry of stone. You walk forward, past the last shadow of the gatehouse, into the quiet heart of the castle, where life once thrived beneath the watchful eyes of guards and gargoyles alike. You step into the passageway beyond the gatehouse and find yourself surrounded by stillness. The air is thicker here, caught between the outer walls and the heart of the keep. Your torch flickers against stone so wide you could walk 3 men side by side inside its depth. The light glides over rough grey surfaces, and you realize how much the castle depends on sound. Every whisper, every breath, every drip of condensation carries a life of its own. According to architectural studies of surviving keeps, some walls reached more than 12 feet in thickness. They were both shield and skeleton, built layer by layer with rubble and lime. The density muffled the chaos outside, but also turned every sound within into an echo. You speak softly and hear your voice return, hushed and slow, as if the stones are trying to answer. You trace your hand along the surface. It feels cool and almost damp, with tiny grains of sand embedded from forgotten centuries. Somewhere deep inside these stones, time itself seems to have a pulse. Builders of the period knew that wide walls kept the temperature steady, protecting against both heat and cold. Yet this design had another secret: acoustics. Messages could travel through the corridors in strange, whispering ways. Servants learned where to stand to overhear conversations meant to remain private. According to old castle household notes, certain servants were valued less for strength and more for their hearing. The thick masonry turned gossip into an invisible weapon. In an age before letters could be trusted, walls themselves became messengers. One curious anecdote from a restored castle in Wales tells of secret speaking holes carved between rooms, hidden under staircases or inside fireplaces. When the fire was out, words could drift like smoke from one chamber to another. It is said that a clever steward once learned of a lord's plot through such a passage and saved himself from execution by vanishing before dawn. Whether this story ever happened or not, the ingenuity behind such designs is undeniable. Some experts continue to discuss whether these channels were intentional or accidental results of shifting stonework, but the legend feels too human to dismiss. People always find ways to make the walls listen. You keep walking, The corridor narrows until you must tilt the torch sideways. The flame dances wildly, and shadows dart across the ceiling like restless birds. The quiet hum of wind pushes through a crack above you, producing a soft whistling note. The sound seems almost deliberate, like a flute buried in the structure. You stop for a moment and let it play. It feels like the building is breathing, sighing through the ages. When the castle was alive with people, this hallway would have been full of small sounds: the rustle of wool skirts, the scrape of boots, the splash of buckets. Sound was information. The rhythm of footsteps told you rank, mood, even the weather outside. A fast stride meant trouble. A dragging step meant exhaustion. In silence, walls spoke the loudest. You step into a larger chamber now, the ceiling lost in shadow. The torchlight catches faint carvings along the plaster, small initials left by masons centuries ago. One inscription reads like a prayer: Deus audinos, God, hear us. You murmur the words under your breath, realizing that for the men who built these walls, stone and faith were the same language. According to a preserved builder's manual from the 14th century, masons often tapped each block with a hammer after placing it, listening for tone. A clear ring meant the joint was solid. A dull thud meant weakness. It was music of labor, a code of sound that only craftsmen understood. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine the noise of construction: hammers striking rhythmically, shouted orders in Latin and Old French, the scrape of scaffolds, the wheeze of oxen pulling stone carts. The castle, before it ever became a fortress, was a symphony of human persistence. A curious custom from some regions involved embedding small charms or coins into the mortar joints for good luck. One castle restoration team discovered a child's shoe sealed within a wall, perfectly preserved. Perhaps it was a charm against evil spirits, or maybe just an accident. There is no certainty now, only wonder. The scholars who studied that discovery offered several interpretations, yet no conclusion satisfied everyone. It is one of those mysteries where archaeology meets folklore, and both bow quietly to time. You move to the center of the room, where faint drafts circle your ankles. Somewhere above, pigeons coo softly in hidden rafters. The castle feels alive again, filled with murmurs instead of silence. You imagine the voices that once filled these halls: lords planning alliances, maids exchanging gossip, priests chanting prayers that echoed like slow bells through the chambers. It strikes you that castles were not only built to protect against enemies outside, but to contain secrets inside. Every whisper stayed trapped between these stones. The walls, you think, are the best historians of all, though they never speak their truths aloud. Your torch begins to wane. The orange glow fades into a pale blue shimmer as moonlight seeps through a high-slit window. The sound of the wind outside rises slightly, weaving through the cracks like a distant song. You take a breath, slow and steady, listening one last time. The hum of history surrounds you, not loud but constant, like the low tide of centuries. As you step forward, leaving behind the whispering walls, you can still hear faint echoes of laughter, prayer, and secret promises that never reached the air beyond. Ahead lies a courtyard, faintly glowing under the night sky. The heart of the castle waits there, filled not with war or silence, but with life. You move toward it slowly, ready to see how ordinary people found warmth within all this stone. You step out into the courtyard, and the air feels instantly different. Gone is the chill of the corridors, replaced by the soft warmth of a night that smells faintly of straw, baked bread, and damp stone. You stand in the heart of the castle's daily rhythm, the place where life hummed quietly, even when the world beyond the walls was chaos. Here, the weight of war gives way to the music of chores. According to household rolls kept by castle stewards, the courtyard was the busiest part of any fortress. It was where cooks prepared meals, blacksmiths repaired armor, and stable boys brushed horses until their hands turned grey with dust. At dawn it would echo with shouts, barking dogs, and the clatter of wooden pails. But at night, like now, everything would soften. The same space that buzzed with command by day would fall into a slow, contented silence. You walk slowly across the uneven stones, imagining how many feet wore them smooth. Every mark under your boots was made by someone who lived, worked, and hoped here. A small but delightful oddity recorded by travellers in the 15th century mentions that some castle courtyards were home to free-roaming cats and even peacocks, kept not only for pest control but as living ornaments. The peacocks strutted like royalty, and the cats ruled like ghosts. The castle's inner life depended on rhythm more than rank. The courtyard was a meeting point of classes, a rare place where a lord might pass a washerwoman without ceremony. Smoke from the kitchen mingled with the scent of hay from the stables, and laughter drifted from the servants' quarters whenever wine was found or rules forgotten. According to surviving chronicles, the design of the courtyard reflected the soul of the castle itself. Some were wide and open, built for sunlight and festivals. Others were narrow, hemmed in by walls that made even daylight feel cautious. You can sense which this one was by the way sound behaves. The echoes come back softly, as if the space prefers whispers to celebration. You find an old well at the centre, its lip worn smooth by centuries of hands. The water within glints faintly under the torchlight. It was more than a necessity. It was the beating heart of survival. When sieges lasted weeks, the entire population of the castle depended on its depth. A well could mean the difference between hope and surrender. A curious practice from medieval households involved dropping small coins or polished stones into the water for luck, believing the well's spirit might guard them in return. Archaeologists still find such offerings at the bottoms of ancient shafts, reminders of the quiet faith that lingered between chores. Some specialists think it was a continuation of older pagan rituals long before castles ever stood. You kneel beside it and drop a pebble into the darkness. The sound takes its time to return, a faint splash that feels older than you can imagine. For a moment, the entire courtyard seems to breathe with that sound. Servants once crossed this space carrying trays of bread or buckets of ash. Children ran through it chasing dogs or each other, their laughter bouncing off the walls. Soldiers sharpened swords here, sparks falling like tiny fireflies. You picture the routine of dusk, torches lit, animals fed, gates checked, prayers murmured. Then the stillness, deep and honest, when everyone finally slept. According to local legend, many castles had a single bench where servants met after curfew to trade stories. It was the unofficial meeting place of the forgotten. A mason might share gossip about the Lord's new taxes, or a cook might whisper about a traveller who had arrived uninvited. Stories born on that bench travelled further than any royal decree. It is intriguing that some historians argue the courtyard was the real centre of medieval social life, not the grand hall. It connected the sacred and the mundane, the noble and the common, in one continuous circle of motion. The hum of a courtyard at work was the heartbeat of the Middle Ages. You lean against the edge of a wall where ivy has begun to reclaim its territory. The leaves shiver gently in the breeze, their pale undersides catching the torchlight. It feels peaceful, almost holy, this blend of ruin and memory. Somewhere above, an owl hoots, its sound perfectly in tune with the rhythm of the night. In the silence that follows, you imagine what it felt like to live within these walls. The fear of invasion must have been real, but so too was the comfort of routine. People woke, worked, loved, and laughed beneath these towers. The courtyard saw it all without judgment. As the torch burns lower, you can almost sense the past settling around you, not as ghosts but as gentle echoes. The stones remember footsteps, but they do not mourn them. You realize that castles were not just symbols of strength, they were villages wrapped in armor, fragile hearts hidden inside steel shells. The last of the torchlight flickers out, leaving you with only moonlight. It glides across the cobbles like silver dust, and in that calm brightness, you hear faint music drifting from the great hall beyond the archway ahead. Someone is singing, softly, as if the night itself is being lulled to sleep. You turn toward the sound, following it through a carved doorway. The air grows warmer, the scent of fire and roasted herbs rising to meet you. The gentle hum of voices beckons you forward, into the glowing light of the great hall where stories, feasts, and politics once mingled like smoke above the hearth. You step through the archway and into the great hall, and for a moment it feels as if you have walked into the lungs of the castle itself. The air here is warm, filled with the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, and candle wax. Your eyes adjust slowly to the glow. The hall stretches high above you, a cavern of timber beams and shadows. Flames from the central hearth throw long patterns across the ceiling like silent banners waving overhead. According to building records from the 13th century, the Great Hall was the first space designed after the keep itself. It served as the castle's public heart, the room where business, ceremony, and daily meals blended together. It was both throne and kitchen, courtroom and stage. The size of a hall reflected its owner's ambition. Some could hold 200 guests beneath a single roof. The first thing you notice is the quiet rhythm of sound. Even when full, such halls would not have been noisy in the way modern crowds are. Voices softened against stone and wood, echoing like the murmuring sea. The long tables lined with benches invited conversation, though rank decided where one Saturday. The Lord's table, raised on a dais, commanded the view of everything, as if to remind everyone that hierarchy never rested. According to one detailed account from a medieval household inventory, the walls of these halls were painted with bright patterns of red and gold, a surprise against the grey stone outside. Light reflected off pewter dishes and polished shields hung decoratively. It was less grim fortress and more theatre of power. A curious footnote from travellers' diaries mentions that some lords kept musicians hidden behind wooden screens, playing softly during meals to disguise unpleasant sounds of chewing or argument. The music was meant to soothe the atmosphere, and sometimes, perhaps, to mask whispers of treachery. You can almost hear the faint notes now, a slow lute melody winding through the air like the breath of sleep. According to chroniclers of the time, meals in the Great Hall were ceremonies of rhythm as much as taste. Bread was the plate, hands were the utensils, and silence was respect. When the Lord lifted his cup, everyone followed. When he set it down, no one dared drink until he did again. Yet for all the formality, the hall also hosted laughter, gossip, and the clinking of mugs after hours when the fire burned low and rules melted into warmth. Archaeological finds of discarded bones and pottery beneath old floor layers reveal that many of these grand gatherings were surprisingly casual once the nobility retired. Servants and guards turned leftovers into late-night meals, singing songs that mocked their masters in clever riddles. Those songs rarely reached parchment, but they linger in the rhythm of oral tradition even today. Some experts continue to wonder whether these halls were more social or symbolic. Were they built to unite a household or to remind everyone who ruled it? The answer changes depending on where you stand. At the dais, you might call it majesty. At the lower benches, you might call it survival. The architecture allowed both interpretations to exist in the same breath. You take a seat at one of the empty benches, the wood smooth and cool. The torchlight glides across the table's surface, catching old knife marks like veins in the grain. The silence feels companionable, not empty. Perhaps that is the greatest secret of such halls. They were built to hold stories even when no one was speaking. Imagine this space at the height of winter. Smoke swirling up to the rafters, dogs stretched by the fire, children half asleep in corners. A bard begins to tell a tale of dragons or saints, his voice low and rhythmic. The crowd leans closer, the glow of the hearth turning faces gold. For a while, the world outside the walls ceases to exist. One well-documented record from a feast at Westminster describes servants moving in precise choreography, carrying dishes of venison and fish seasoned with cloves and saffron. The scent alone must have been intoxicating, especially to guests unaccustomed to such abundance. Yet behind that luxury lay the hands of countless workers. Every plate of food represented a network of labor: farmers, millers, hunters, and cooks, all invisible to the high table. You glance at the fireplace. It is wide enough to stand in, lined with iron hooks for pots and spits. The fire's light flickers against carvings in the mantel, scenes of saints and battles meant to inspire both piety and fear. One small carving catches your eye, a fox in a monk's robe carrying a goose. You smile at the irony. Even stone could keep a joke alive for centuries. A gentle wind moves through the hall, carrying a faint chill from the cracks in the walls. The torches flutter, their smoke rising like lazy ghosts. You listen for a moment and realize the hall hums with a kind of warmth that does not depend on temperature. It is the warmth of human presence layered through time, a comfort that lingers even after centuries of emptiness. Some restorers believe that acoustically, these vast rooms were designed to make voices sound grander than they were. A simple speech could fill the space with authority. You test this theory, whispering softly into the dark. The echo returns with surprising clarity, as though the castle approves of your intrusion. You sit for a while longer, letting the crackle of imaginary fire settle your mind. The great hall feels less like a monument and more like a memory still unfolding. The smell of smoke seems to cling to your clothes. At last you rise, your torch burning low. Ahead, a narrow stairway curves upward into the keep. The air there will be colder, the shadows thicker. It is where people slept, dreamed, and sometimes plotted in silence. You take one last glance at the long tables and the darkened hearth, then move toward the steps, your footsteps echoing softly into the sleeping castle. The stairs twist upward in tight circles, each step worn hollow by the weight of centuries. The air cools as you climb, and the scent of smoke fades into the faint aroma of wax, wool, and damp stone. You arrive at a heavy wooden door. Its surface is scarred, its handle polished smooth by long use. When you push it open, a rush of stillness greets you. This is the private world of the castle, where the noise of feasts gives way to the quiet of breath and dreams. According to estate inventories from the 14th century, sleeping chambers in castles varied wildly in comfort. The lord and lady might sleep in a chamber lined with tapestries and furs, while servants curled up near hearths or even stairwells. Temperature was the great equalizer. Stone held cold like a secret. Winter nights could be brutal, even for those with rank. The first thing you notice inside the chamber is the bed, a small raised island surrounded by heavy curtains. The air within must have been thick and warm, trapping heat from bodies and candles alike. Contemporary letters from noble women often mention how beds were a fortress within a fortress. They were private sanctuaries, but also social spaces where families talked, prayed, and sometimes conducted business before dawn. A curious observation found in a medieval hygiene manual describes people sleeping in shifts, each turn marked by the church bells. The practice of first sleep and second sleep meant that midnight was often a time of wakeful quiet, perfect for reflection, prayer, or mischief. Imagine the castle at that hour, its torches dimmed, its corridors hushed, yet a few candles flickering behind drawn curtains. Archaeological evidence reveals that mattresses were filled not with feathers, as often imagined, but with straw, reeds, or dried heather. The straw would be changed a few times a year and scented with herbs such as lavender or thyme to keep pests away. The faint perfume must have been comforting, though it could never fully mask the chill seeping through the floor. A small but curious detail from one surviving household account tells of servants warming beds with pans filled with coals wrapped in cloth. The idea was to take the edge off the cold before the master retired. Occasionally, the pans burned holes through the blankets, so the servants were scolded for doing their job too enthusiastically. You can almost picture the laughter in the scullery afterward, when no one important was listening. The quiet here is immense. You hear only the distant sigh of wind through a slit window. You move closer to the bed and touch the fabric of the curtain. It is heavy and rough beneath your fingers, woven from wool and lined with fading embroidery. Each stitch, a tiny act of patience. In a world without central heat, these curtains were not luxury but survival. They trapped warmth and privacy in a single motion. Some historians still discuss whether people slept fully lying down. In certain regions, noblemen preferred to rest half-sitting, believing that lying flat invited death or illness. Beds were shorter as a result, and you imagine how odd it must feel to drift to sleep, propped on pillows, face tilted toward a flickering candle. The thought adds a quiet intimacy to this room, a vulnerability not often associated with stone fortresses. You wander toward the narrow window, where moonlight spills across the floor. From here, the courtyard below looks softer, silvered by mist. Somewhere, a dog barks once, then falls silent. The night holds its breath. You think of how many centuries of sleep this castle has witnessed, how many dreams dissolved into this same air. There are other beds in smaller rooms nearby. A nursemaid might doze lightly beside a cradle. Guards might snore against the wall, wrapped in cloaks. Sleep was never entirely private in the Middle Ages. Even kings shared chambers with attendants or guards, partly for safety, partly for warmth. The modern idea of solitude was rare, perhaps even frightening. One of the most charming details found in a 15th century account describes a lord who kept a small dog at the foot of his bed, not for affection but as an alarm against rats. The dog, of course, often chose to nap through its duties, but the gesture says something about comfort and company in a time before locks and insulation. Scholars have pointed out that dreams played a significant role in medieval belief. People saw them as messages from God or omens of fate. A bad dream could prompt a priestly consultation by morning, while a good one might be celebrated as divine reassurance. You imagine a nobleman waking at dawn, retelling his vision of flying angels or talking lions, while his servants nodded politely and poured the morning ale. You walk to the hearth at the far end of the room. The ashes there are long cold, but you can almost smell the ghost of smoke. Someone once sat before this fire, their face half lit, perhaps thinking of love, fear, or simply the next harvest. In that moment, the castle ceases to be a monument and becomes a home again, fragile and real. A faint draught curls through the room, lifting the edge of a curtain. The fabric sways gently, as if stirred by a sleeper's sigh. You feel an odd peace settle in, the same kind of peace that comes from hearing rain on a roof while lying in bed. The stones, for all their chill, seem to cradle the silence kindly. You linger a moment longer, letting the calm sink in. Then, through a side door, you glimpse another space where faint light glimmers on tiled walls. The air smells faintly of herbs and water. The bathing chamber waits, promising warmth and another kind of secret entirely. You follow the faint scent of steam and herbs until you reach a narrow archway. Beyond it lies a small chamber with curved walls and a shallow basin carved into the floor. The air feels warmer here, thick with the ghost of old moisture. For a moment, it is hard to believe that bathing ever belonged inside castles, those fortresses of cold stone and duty. Yet here it is, a quiet sanctuary where cleanliness mingled with ritual, comfort, and a touch of vanity. According to personal letters and records from noble households, bathing was far from forgotten in the Middle Ages. People bathed more often than legends suggest, though not daily as in modern times. Warm water was a luxury that required firewood, servants, and patience. Baths were planned events, almost social occasions. A tub might be set before the hearth, filled with buckets carried up from the kitchen. Curtains were drawn around it for privacy, though never complete secrecy. Archaeological discoveries in castle ruins reveal intricate heating systems known as hypercausts, especially in royal residences. These early underfloor structures carried hot air from furnaces beneath tiled chambers. The wealthy could step into a small bathing room that glowed with warmth even in the heart of winter. The concept, borrowed from ancient Rome, never fully vanished. It simply hid behind the stone walls of the elite. One interesting custom recorded by a 13th century chronicler tells of scented oils added to the water. Rose, lavender, and sometimes vinegar mixed with herbs were believed to strengthen the body and purify the soul. The fragrance lingered in hair and fabric, marking both cleanliness and privilege. Imagine the hallways afterward, softly perfumed, each noble carrying a trace of the bath like invisible jewelry. A charming yet peculiar detail survives in a manuscript from Bohemia, which mentions that some lords invited trusted friends or relatives to share the same tub. It was considered an act of intimacy and political goodwill, not scandal. People spoke of alliances and arranged marriages while half submerged in steaming water. Such gatherings blurred the line between diplomacy and relaxation. Some experts still discuss whether this practice was widespread or exaggerated by gossiping writers, but the image endures: candles flickering, servants pouring water, and two nobles discussing trade routes while surrounded by clouds of steam. History can be surprisingly human when you imagine it unfolding beneath a towel. You dip your fingers into the basin before you, and though the water is long gone, you can almost feel its warmth. The smooth stone beneath your fingertips has been polished by countless hands. A fragment of tile still bears traces of blue glaze, delicate as a raindrop. The artisans who built this chamber cared about beauty, even where few would see it. According to medieval medical theory, cleanliness was tied to balance. Physicians of the time spoke of the four humours and how washing could restore harmony between them. Hot water was believed to open the pores of the body and the doors of the soul. Some monks even prescribed bathing as spiritual therapy, though others warned against indulgence. You can picture a confessor frowning gently, while a noble insists that her weekly bath is purely for health, not vanity. The chamber smells faintly of herbs even now. Perhaps mint once grew in pots near the window. A narrow wooden bench sits by the wall, darkened with age. You can imagine a servant kneeling there, pouring water from a copper jug, humming softly to fill the silence. It must have been an oddly intimate task, serving warmth to another person one bowl at a time. There are curious notes from castle inventories mentioning portable wooden tubs lined with linen to prevent splinters. They were often dismantled after use and stored in attics. Some were shaped like barrels with hinged lids to keep the water hot longer. The image is almost whimsical. A lord sitting inside a giant cup, steam rising, while outside the wind howls through the battlements. Scholars continue to debate whether the decline in bathing habits came later with colder climates, stricter moral codes, or the fear of disease during the plague years. It seems that over time, the pleasure of water gave way to the discipline of modesty. Yet here, in this chamber, the story feels simpler. Warmth was a treasure, and cleanliness a kind of courage against the cold world outside. You move closer to the small window above the tub. It opens just enough for a thin ribbon of air to flow in. From here, the scent of the courtyard drifts faintly upward. Hay, horses, and distant bread. You can almost hear the sound of a bucket being filled somewhere below. It connects this quiet space to the beating life of the castle, reminding you that even luxury needed labor. A story survives in local folklore about a washerwoman who once dropped a lord's towel into the moat by accident. Instead of punishment, the lord laughed and said the fish would now enjoy his perfume. True or not, it speaks of a humor that occasionally softened hierarchy, even within these rigid walls. You take one last look at the room. The floor glows faintly in the torchlight, and the shadows ripple like water. For a brief moment, the space feels alive again, filled with the quiet rhythm of pouring, scrubbing, and sighing. The scent of roses seems to hang in the air, imagined yet persistent. You turn toward the door, feeling the cooler air of the hallway brush your face. Beyond this chamber lies another kind of garden, one that never needed fire or stone. The castle's outer gardens wait quietly under the stars, full of fragrance and memory. You step toward that distant green glow, leaving behind the last curl of invisible steam. You walk through a narrow passage that opens suddenly into a walled garden, and the change feels like stepping into another world. The air softens immediately, carrying the scent of earth, dew, and faint blossoms that somehow survive the centuries. Moonlight filters through trellised vines, tracing patterns on the stone path beneath your feet. After so much darkness inside the castle, this feels like a secret whispered by the land itself. According to monastic garden records and estate plans, nearly every castle of importance maintained at least one enclosed garden. These were known as herbers or pleasaunces, spaces designed not for war or labor but for peace. Lords and ladies came here to walk, pray, or talk in confidence. The garden served as both medicine and meditation. You pause beside a raised bed where ghostly leaves shimmer in the silver light. You can almost see what once grew here: rosemary for memory, sage for wisdom, lavender for rest. Medieval gardeners believed each plant carried both a purpose and a spirit. They arranged flowers according to symbolic order, so even color told a story. Green for renewal, red for courage, white for purity. It was nature shaped into language. Archaeological surveys of castle grounds show that these gardens were often positioned near the living quarters for easy access. Some even had small fountains or running water, fed by channels from the moat or nearby springs. The gentle sound of trickling water was thought to soothe the mind and purify the air. You imagine that quiet music now, blending with the distant hoot of an owl. One recorded custom from a 14th century castle in France describes evening walks taken by the lady of the household and her attendants. They would stroll in pairs, carrying small lamps, their laughter echoing softly against the walls. Gardens were among the few places women could move freely, and they filled the space with stories, songs, and secrets. A delightful yet peculiar note appears in a gardener's diary from the same period. He wrote of planting strawberries near the path, not only for their fruit but to symbolize humility. When the Lord's children stooped to pick them, it was meant as a lesson to remember modesty despite privilege. Such quiet teaching through design reveals a gentleness hidden inside the rigid order of the age. Some historians continue to explore whether castle gardens were more medicinal or aesthetic in purpose. The truth may lie somewhere between. Herbalists treated wounds and fevers with plants grown just beyond the walls, yet the same flowers were woven into garlands for dances and festivals. Beauty and healing were not separate in the medieval mind. You walk deeper into the garden, where the air grows sweeter. The night is alive with the faint rustle of leaves, the soft chirping of crickets, and the distant hum of sleeping bees in their hives. The earth feels springy under your boots, as though it remembers footsteps that once moved slower and gentler here. You come upon a bench carved from stone, smooth with age. Perhaps a knight once sat here, removing his helmet to breathe freely for a moment. Perhaps a lady paused to read a psalm, the parchment trembling in the breeze. This place blurs time. Each breath you take feels like a shared memory. In one famous medieval poem, the garden was described as a mirror of the soul, enclosed by walls not to imprison nature but to protect it from corruption. Sitting here, you understand. The castle was a fortress for the body, but the garden was a refuge for the heart. The two depended on each other, stone and soil holding the same promise of endurance. A curious anecdote from a chronicler mentions that during sieges, noble families sometimes retreated to their gardens at night to pray among the plants. They believed that the living earth listened more kindly than the echoing walls. When food ran low, they ate the herbs that once served as decoration. The boundary between beauty and survival vanished completely. You touch the rough bark of an old tree that leans against the wall. Perhaps it once bore apples or quince, fruits prized for their sweetness and rarity. In medieval banquets, such fruits were symbols of paradise, reminders that even inside fortresses, people longed for the gentleness of Eden. The scent of crushed leaves under your hand releases a faint bitterness that feels honest, ancient. The moonlight brightens slightly, revealing a small stone basin at the garden's center. The surface of the water reflects the stars, perfectly still. You bend to look closer and see the reflection of the castle tower above you, pale and soft, framed by vines. The sight feels like a quiet lesson in balance. Nature and architecture, power and peace, all mirrored in silence. Some later writers claimed that gardens within castles were the beginnings of romance as we imagine it today. The idea of love as both tender and secret may have grown from places like this, where guarded hearts found privacy among flowers. You imagine two figures meeting here, voices low, words slower than breathing. Their shadows would have merged with the leaves, leaving only a faint trace of warmth in the air. The torch in your hand burns lower now, and its glow blends gently with the moonlight. The garden seems to sigh, content to return to its dreams. You walk toward a narrow archway at the far side, where a faint path climbs toward another set of chambers. The air cools again, carrying the faint sound of a spinning wheel and the murmur of soft voices. Ahead lies the world of those who worked unseen, who kept the rhythm of castle life steady. The women behind the walls wait quietly, their stories woven into every stitch of fabric and every secret whispered in candlelight. You follow the sound upward, leaving the garden's perfume behind. You climb a narrow stairway that leads toward a long corridor lined with faded tapestries. The air smells faintly of linen and beeswax, touched with the sweetness of herbs from sachets tucked behind curtains. The torches here burn softer, their light golden and slow. This part of the castle feels gentler, shaped not by battle but by patience. The whisper of spinning wheels and the occasional clink of embroidery needles fill the silence. This is the world of women who lived behind the walls, steady as the castle's pulse. According to records of noble households, the daily lives of women inside castles varied as widely as the fortunes of their families. Some commanded estates in their husband's absence, signing charters and managing accounts with sharp precision. Others spent endless days at looms, stitching tapestries that told stories more lasting than any written book. Power here took quiet forms, influence through conversation, through faith, through the careful art of waiting. A well-documented account of Eleanor of Aquitaine describes her as both ruler and prisoner, her chambers becoming her courtroom when politics demanded her silence. Her story shows how the domestic heart of the castle could also become its most subtle battlefield. Control was exercised not by swords but by words spoken over embroidery frames and letters written by candlelight. You step into one of those chambers now. The air is warm from a small brazier glowing in the corner. A spindle rests on a table beside a half-finished tapestry. The fabric shows a garden, much like the one you just left, with birds and vines curling toward the edges. The threads shimmer faintly, dyed in blues and reds that have barely faded. According to dye recipes recorded by medieval craft guilds, these colors were made from crushed minerals and plants. Lapis, madder root, wode each hue carrying a name and a cost. A curious detail from one surviving account mentions that noblewomen often used secret symbols within their embroidery. A stitched hawk might represent freedom, a lily could hint at loyalty, and a small, almost hidden fox might mock the men who never thought to look closely. These works were conversations in code, patience turned into art. Some researchers still discuss whether these tapestries were entirely the work of noble hands or mostly of servants, but perhaps both are true. The rhythm of weaving blurred rank and duty. Each pull of thread was a meditation, each knot a quiet act of creation. You imagine the women seated in a half-circle here centuries ago. Their voices rise and fall softly. One recites a psalm, another hums a tune, another whispers the latest gossip from the courtyard. They are dressed in wool and linen, their sleeves gathered neatly to keep from the spinning wheels. For hours they sit together, time measured not by clocks but by finished stitches. A charming but lesser-known note from an Italian castle ledger describes how ladies kept songbirds in cages near their work tables. The birds sang to mark the passing of daylight, their songs mingling with the soft drone of spinning. One chronicler even joked that the birds were the castle's most loyal musicians, never asking for pay and always performing in key. You look toward a small writing desk by the window. A quill rests beside a folded piece of parchment, sealed with wax long cooled. Many letters that shaped history were written in such rooms, though signed by men who never set foot in them. The women behind those words acted as diplomats, mediators, and messengers. It was through these letters that marriages were arranged, truces proposed, and rumors softened into strategy. Some historians point out that literacy among noble women was higher than once believed. Monastic schools trained them not only to read scripture, but also to write elegantly, blending piety with politics. You picture a lady leaning over her parchment, her candle flickering while she weighs each phrase like a jewel. Her words might one day decide the fate of a province, though no one would ever carve her name in stone. You glance toward a small cradle near the hearth. The rhythm of castle life also included the quiet work of raising children. Wet nurses and governesses formed a hidden community within these walls. Songs, lullabies, and bedtime prayers filled the nights when storms howled beyond the battlements. The tenderness of motherhood existed here alongside the iron of duty. A curious anecdote recorded in a household account from the Low Countries mentions that children of noble birth often learned their first letters stitched into cloth by their mothers. Instead of ink, they traced the alphabet in thread. It was education woven into affection, a way to teach both patience and meaning at once. You move closer to the tapestry again and notice a small imperfection, a thread pulled loose, curling like a question mark. It feels oddly alive, as if the story still wishes to speak. Perhaps that is what these women left behind, threads of memory woven so deeply that even time cannot quite unravel them. Some experts continue to reflect on whether women of the castle were truly confined or quietly free within their own domains. The answer may rest somewhere in this chamber, where authority takes the form of calm endurance. You sense it now, the strength that moves slowly but never yields. A breeze slips in through the window, stirring the tapestry so that its woven garden seems to sway gently. The motion feels like a sigh, or perhaps a song that only the night can hear. You take one last look at the quiet hearth, then step toward the door. The hum of life beyond grows louder again, armor clinking, laughter, and the rhythmic sound of footsteps. Beyond this corridor lies the world of knights, where the weight of armor replaces the weight of fabric. You follow the sound upward, toward a chamber filled with echoes of training yards, shields, and songs of courage that linger even after the battle's end. You step out of the quiet corridor and into the open air again, where moonlight spills across a training yard paved with hard-packed dirt. The smell of iron and sweat lingers faintly, though no soldiers stand here now. The wooden targets lean crooked, their straw faces pierced and silent. The ghosts of drills still seem to echo in the rhythm of the wind. This was the world of the knights when they were not at war, when the sword was both tool and burden. According to military records and personal letters from the late 12th century, knights spent more time maintaining discipline than fighting. Training was relentless. Sword practice, mounted combat, archery, and even dance formed part of their routine. Balance was everything. A knight who could not move gracefully was as useless in armor as a falcon with broken wings. You imagine the mornings here, the clang of metal rising with the dawn, the scrape of blades on whetstones, the grunts of effort from men swinging wooden swords until blisters split their palms. Pages and squires hurried to fetch water, their voices breaking from youth and exhaustion alike. By midday, the air would shimmer with heat and dust, and still the drills continued. One well-preserved training manual, written by a master-at-arms in 14th century Germany, describes exercises so precise they read almost like choreography. Knights were instructed to move with rhythm, to anticipate motion as if dancing with the opponent. It was not brute strength that won a fight, but timing and calm. You picture that now, a line of men in chainmail stepping and striking in near silence, each movement measured like a heartbeat. A curious bit of everyday life emerges from another record, which mentions that knights often played games resembling modern tennis or fencing during rest periods. The games were meant to sharpen reflexes and camaraderie. Laughter filled the courtyard between clangs of steel. The sound must have carried strangely through the halls, part joy, part mockery of death. Some experts continue to argue about whether knights truly lived by their famous code of chivalry or if it was an invention of poets. The truth may lie somewhere between ideal and reality. The code preached mercy and honor, but the battlefield rewarded cunning. Yet even cynics admit that the dream of knighthood shaped how men saw themselves. It gave their violence purpose, their discipline grace. You find a bench along the wall and sit, the stone cool beneath you. The night breeze brings faint traces of oil and leather. Nearby, a helmet rests on a broken rack, its surface dented but still gleaming in the moonlight. You lift it gently and feel its weight. Imagine wearing it for hours, the sound of your own breath trapped inside. Courage must have felt heavy, sometimes unbearable. Knights were not always noble by birth. Many rose from modest families through skill and luck. Service brought prestige but also danger, for a single mistake could erase years of loyalty. A chronicler once noted that a knight's greatest battle was often with pride itself. Too much of it led to ruin, too little left one forgotten. In the evenings, after drills ended, the yard would transform into a different kind of arena. Torches flickered, wine passed from hand to hand, and songs rose into the night. You can almost hear them now, deep voices singing of lost battles, of women waiting by candlelight, of comrades who never returned. The songs carried sadness wrapped in strength. According to an old minstrel's verse preserved in a monastery library, even the bravest knights feared silence. It reminded them of what courage could not defeat. That is why they sang loudly, laughed easily, and drank heartily to keep the darkness from creeping in. You let that thought settle, the idea that bravery was not absence of fear but mastery of it. A small and curious tradition recorded in castle accounts speaks of knights keeping tokens tied to their armor, locks of hair, bits of ribbon, or small carved charms. Some were from lovers, others from mothers or friends. They served as reminders that someone waited for their return. When a knight fell in battle, these trinkets were often buried with him, his story tied forever to those who remembered him. Archaeologists have found such fragments in burial sites, fragile ribbons that crumble at a touch. Yet they speak more eloquently than any sword. They tell of humanity surviving beneath armor. You find that comforting, even now. The training yard feels quiet again. You hear only the faint whistle of wind slipping through arrow slits. The helmet in your hands catches the moonlight once more before you set it gently down. Somewhere deep in the castle, laughter rises, the easy laughter of men at rest. Some historians believe that these moments of camaraderie, more than battle or duty, define the life of a knight. Bonds forged in boredom and shared danger lasted longer than most alliances written in ink. You can almost sense that warmth lingering in the stones around you, a trace of fellowship that time has not quite erased. You stand and stretch, the cool night air brushing against your face. Ahead, a faint orange glow spills from a doorway leading into another chamber. The scent of spices drifts out: pepper, cloves, and roasted meat. The kitchen waits there, alive with the memory of smoke and laughter. You take one last look at the empty training yard, then follow the smell toward the heart of the castle's appetite, where iron and fire served peace as faithfully as they once served war. You follow the warm scent until the stone corridor opens into the kitchen, and the world changes again. The air feels alive here, thick with smoke, spices, and the hum of invisible labor. The torchlight glints off copper pots and soot-blackened walls. A faint draught stirs the ashes in a vast fireplace, large enough to roast an ox. You can almost hear the hiss of dripping fat and the crackle of wood, as if the fire was still burning. According to surviving inventories from great houses, the castle kitchen was often the most complex room in the entire structure. It was not just a place to cook, but a miniature industry. There were separate stations for baking, brewing, butchering, and preserving. Each task had its rhythm and smell. Even now you can almost taste it. The sharp tang of vinegar, the sweetness of honey, the salt of the sea stored in heavy barrels. The master cook, often trained like a commander, ran the kitchen with military precision. Orders came from the hall above, dishes left in waves, and timing was everything. A single delay could insult a noble guest or spoil an entire feast. According to one surviving ledger from the court of Edward I, kitchens employed dozens of servants, each sworn to secrecy about recipes and techniques. Flavor was power. One delightful detail appears in the journal of a French scribe who visited English castles in the 14th century. He noted that the cooks spoke a language of their own, mixing Norman, Latin, and local slang into a stew of sounds that outsiders could barely understand. To hear them shout across the room was to hear a kind of culinary music, sharp and rhythmic as knives on wood. You walk closer to the long table where herbs once lay drying in bundles. A faint aroma of sage and marjoram still lingers in the wood. The surface is scarred with thousands of knife marks, each one a trace of movement. Here is where politics met appetite. Food was diplomacy, an edible language that could flatter, insult, or declare allegiance without a single word. Archaeological evidence shows that medieval diets were far richer and more inventive than legend suggests. Pies filled with spiced fruit, almond milk thickened with breadcrumbs, roasted game rubbed with pepper and cinnamon luxuries imported from distant lands through dangerous routes. The very presence of these flavors was proof of connection and influence. A banquet was a map of power you could taste. A curious practice from a northern castle record describes the making of illusion foods, dishes shaped to resemble something else entirely. A fish might be molded to look like a peacock, or bread dyed with saffron to mimic gold. The intent was to astonish guests, to blur the line between nourishment and spectacle. You can imagine the laughter that followed, the applause of diners too full to care about deception. Some culinary historians still discuss whether medieval cooking leaned more toward art or survival. It is easy to forget that behind the feasts lay long hours of smoke, sweat, and danger. Fires burned constantly, knives slipped, and the air itself turned thick with soot. Yet those who worked here sang while they labored. Songs about bread rising, about barrels of ale, about lovers waiting far away. Work and music kept the rhythm of the day alive. You move toward a smaller alcove where clay ovens stand cold. Their round mouths gape like sleeping faces. A faint layer of flour dust still clings to the stones. In its time, this was the baker's domain. Bread was sacred in every sense, a symbol of sustenance and divine grace. Each loaf that left this room carried both nourishment and blessing. A minor but fascinating entry in an abbey chronicle mentions that before large feasts, the head cook would mark the first loaf with the sign of the cross before it baked, not out of superstition but gratitude. It was a quiet acknowledgement that survival itself was a kind of miracle. You imagine the evening bustle that once filled this space. Cooks shouting for more wood, the spit boy turning meat until his arms ached, dogs waiting under the tables for scraps. The kitchen was chaos and community in equal measure. Class divisions blurred here as hunger and heat made everyone human. At the far end of the room, a small door leads into a cool cellar. You step through it and feel the temperature drop instantly. Shelves carved into the walls still hold faint outlines where jars once stood. This was the castle's memory and storage. Salted fish, dried fruit, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth. A place where time could be slowed by patience and salt. Some researchers suggest that the kitchen staff formed a world apart within the castle, bound by skill and secrecy. To feed hundreds in a fortress required trust. You had to know when to season a dish and when to stay silent. In a way, these cooks were alchemists, turning raw matter into moments of joy that dissolved almost as soon as they were tasted. You return to the main hearth, where the air feels warmer again. The ashes glow faintly in your imagination, as if someone has just banked the fire for the night. The smell of smoke lingers in your hair. You can almost hear a last murmur of voices, laughter softening into fatigue. There is peace in the aftermath of labor, the stillness that follows heat and noise. You stand for a moment, breathing in that silence. Then, from beyond the courtyard, A new sound rises, the low rumble of hooves, the faint neigh of horses, and a soft cluck that could only belong to hens. You smile. The animals of the castle are awake in memory, waiting for their turn in this story. You leave the kitchen, stepping through the doorway into the crisp air of the stables, where the rhythm of life continues in hooves, wings, and quiet devotion. You step into the courtyard again, and the smell changes from spice and smoke to hay, manure, and damp straw. The air feels heavier but alive, filled with the soft shuffle of hooves and the faint rustle of wings from the loft above. This is the castle's other kingdom, one ruled not by lords or knights, but by creatures who carried its weight, guarded its nights, and gave it breath. According to surviving stable records, every great castle kept a small army of animals. Horses, of course, were the pride of the yard. War horses called destriers were worth more than some villages, trained for years to respond to pressure, sound, and fear. They were as disciplined as their riders. Yet beside these giants stood smaller breeds, palfreys for ladies, pack horses for supply trains, and ponies for children learning to ride. Every animal had a place and a purpose. You walk along the row of stalls. The air smells warm and sweet, like hay soaked in Sunday. You can almost hear the quiet snort of a horse shifting in its sleep, the clink of a harness, the sigh of leather straps as they sway from their hooks. According to old travel diaries, castles were never truly silent at night. The animals' breathing filled the gaps between human voices, a living background hum of comfort. A curious bit of everyday life survives in a 13th century steward's list. It notes that each horse was given a name, often in Latin or French, and blessed during Mass. Names like Fortis, Griselle, or Luna appear again and again, as if the naming itself bestowed dignity. Some chroniclers even claimed that horses recognized their own names when spoken softly. You whisper one now, and the word seems to stir the air as if memory might answer. Archaeological evidence from Castle Middens shows that smaller animals lived much closer to people than we often imagine. Chickens wandered freely through courtyards, goats were tethered near kitchens for milk, and dogs slept by doorways, serving as both guards and companions. Cats stalked through storerooms, fierce little guardians of grain and parchment alike. Life here was never sterile. The scent of the barn mixed with that of bread, sweat, and smoke until it all became one smell: existence. One delightful but strange note comes from a Welsh poem that describes a goose kept as a kind of sentry bird. Its honking was said to warn of intruders long before a watchman's cry. The image is amusing yet practical. In a world without alarms, feathers could serve where iron failed. Some historians continue to debate how animals were treated in castles. Evidence paints a mixed picture. Horses and hounds of the nobility were cherished, groomed daily, and buried with ceremony. Livestock and working beasts, by contrast, were often seen as property rather than partners. Yet even then, there were exceptions. A record from a northern abbey describes a stable boy who carved small crosses into the wooden beams above each stall, asking protection for the creatures in his care. Faith, it seems, extended beyond the human. You climb a short ladder into the hayloft, where the air is thick with dust and the faint sweetness of dried clover. The loft once stored fodder, but also served as a makeshift sleeping space for servants or guards on rotation. Imagine lying here on a winter night, half buried in hay, the sounds of animals rising softly below. Warmth, breath, and rhythm, the castle's heartbeat in living form. A small but telling discovery during a castle excavation revealed bones of pets buried separately from livestock. One was a small dog wrapped in linen, placed near what had been a doorway. Scholars still wonder if it was buried there to guard the threshold even in death. The idea fits with how medieval people saw the world, not as separate species, but as a web of service, loyalty, and spirit. You sit on a bale and look down. The shadows of the stalls stretch long across the floor. Somewhere below you hear the faint squeak of a mouse and smile at the thought that not much has changed. Nature, even surrounded by walls, always finds a way to continue its quiet work. According to a handful of royal hunting accounts, dogs held a special place in castle life. They were more than tools for sport. They were companions who slept beside their masters and followed them into battle. Breeds were carefully bred and trained. A hunting dog could carry its own heraldic collar, a mark of prestige shared with its owner. In some illuminated manuscripts, dogs are painted sitting at the foot of saints and kings alike, a symbol of loyalty that transcended rank. The air grows cooler as you climb down again. You cross the yard toward the edge of the wall, where a dovecote rises, like a small tower of its own. Hundreds of small holes pock the inside walls, each once home to a pigeon. Their droppings were valuable for fertilizer, their feathers for writing quills, their meat for the table. Even birds had their role in the castle's balance. A curious anecdote recorded by a monk describes a lord who released pigeons carrying messages to his wife during long campaigns. The letters were tied with silk thread, sometimes no more than a few words of affection. One bird even returned months later, bedraggled but alive. The chronicler called it a miracle. You prefer to think of it as devotion, stubborn and winged. You walk back toward the main courtyard, passing a well-trodden path that glows faintly in the moonlight. The night feels alive, filled with invisible company. Every sound, the snort of a horse, the flap of wings, the soft hum of crickets reminds you that castles were ecosystems as much as fortresses. As you reach the doorway to the next hall, the animal noises fade into quiet again. Ahead lies a different kind of life, etched into the very stone itself. Carvings, scratches, and forgotten drawings wait to speak their silent messages. The castle's walls are ready to tell you what its people could not. You step once more into the shadow of the inner walls, leaving behind the warm breath of the stables. The air inside is cool again, dry and faintly scented with dust and lichen. Your torchlight glides across the stones, and for the first time you begin to notice that the walls are not empty at all. They are alive with markings, a quiet archive written by countless forgotten hands. According to conservation studies of castle interiors, carved graffiti has been found in nearly every surviving fortress. It ranges from careful inscriptions of names to rough sketches of ships, crosses, faces, or even prayers. These were not acts of vandalism, but expressions of existence. A mason, a prisoner, a servant, a child, each left a mark to say, "I was here." You bend close to one section and trace a faint heart carved into the surface, its lines shallow but stubbornly visible after hundreds of years. The masons who built these castles often signed their work with small symbols, hidden within the mortar lines. It was a form of identity and pride in a time when most labourers were nameless. According to guild records from the 14th century, each mason's mark was unique, used like a signature to ensure payment for the blocks he had cut. What looks like random scratches today once carried personal meaning, a language only builders could read. A curious discovery in one English keep revealed a small drawing of a sailing ship carved deep inside a tower far from the sea. Scholars puzzled over it for years before deciding that it might have been made by a homesick mason from the coast. It is a gentle thought that even within stone walls, the human mind drifts back to open water. You move your torch along the surface, and another set of markings appears, faint lines forming a figure, perhaps a saint or an angel. The face is worn smooth, but the gesture of raised hands remains. Some historians suggest that these carvings were talismans, protections against misfortune or evil. In an age of faith and superstition, the boundary between prayer and craft was thin. A particularly intriguing example comes from a castle chapel in Normandy, where an inscription reads Oremus pro nobis beside a crude drawing of a wolf. The meaning is still debated. Was it a plea for divine protection, or a symbolic warning to enemies? Interpretations shift like light on stone. You smile at the thought that even scholars cannot fully decode what the builders perhaps never intended to explain. You pass through a narrow arch and find a spiral staircase descending into shadow. The walls here grow damper, the air colder. As you descend, the markings change. Gone are the neat lines of craftsmen. Instead, you find crude scratches, gouged deep by trembling hands. The letters are uneven, some backwards, others almost desperate. Prisoners left these. They carved prayers, curses, or simply names to prove they existed when no one else would. One well-preserved inscription in a Scottish dungeon reads, Jesu mercy, Maria save me. The letters are shaky, carved with something blunt, perhaps a nail or a belt buckle. You stand there imagining the flicker of a dying candle, the smell of mould and fear, the slow passing of hours. The walls absorbed that pain, and in silence they still hold it. A curious discovery made during restoration in an Irish fortress revealed tiny carvings of animals in a dungeon wall: a horse, a dog, a bird. The artist was never identified, perhaps a guard passing the time, or a prisoner remembering freedom. Such small acts of imagination are the castle's true secrets. They show that even in confinement, people found a way to create. Some researchers continue to ask whether certain markings were purely personal or had ritual meaning. Circles known as witch marks have been found near doorways and windows, drawn to ward off evil spirits. To the medieval mind, the unseen world was as real as the visible one. The castle's defences extended to both sword and symbol. You pause in front of one particularly delicate carving, a labyrinth. Its lines twist inward, spiraling toward a single point. Your torchlight shivers over it, and the pattern seems to move. Perhaps someone carved it as a prayer, a way to focus thought while confined in the dark. You trace its path with your finger and feel a strange calm. The maker is long gone, yet the shape still performs its quiet magic. Another detail catches your eye higher up, where the soot from torches has stained the wall. Someone once pressed their hand into wet plaster, leaving a perfect palm print. It is small, perhaps a child's. You press your own hand over it and feel the strange intimacy of time collapsing. The warmth of your skin against ancient stone feels like a handshake through centuries. A poet once wrote that castles were built to resist time, but their walls ended up recording it instead. You understand now. Every scratch, every mark, every whisper trapped between stones is a piece of memory disguised as architecture. You step back and let your torchlight play across the wall one last time. The carvings seem to shimmer faintly as the flame flickers. For a moment, it feels as if all those silent voices stir again, united by the simple desire to be remembered. Then you turn away and climb back toward the light. The air grows warmer as you ascend. Above, you can hear the faint cry of a sentry and the rustle of banners in the wind. The marks in the stone fade into shadow behind you, but their presence lingers in your thoughts. Beyond this stairway lies another part of the castle's story, the times when its defences were tested, when fear pressed against its gates, and hope became a matter of patience. You step upward into that tension, ready to see how people endured the sieges that shaped both their walls and their minds. You emerge into the pale moonlight again, and the air feels sharper here, touched by the memory of conflict. The walls seem taller, the silence heavier. This is where the castle once prepared for its greatest fear, a siege. The open yard stretches before you, calm now, but it once bristled with tension, its quiet broken by shouts, hammer blows, and the crack of firewood turned to defence. According to royal military records from the 13th century, the average siege could last weeks or even months. More castles fell to starvation and exhaustion than to sword or flame. The people who lived within these walls understood that survival was an art of patience. Every grain of wheat, every bucket of water, every torch was counted and rationed. You can almost see them now, men and women moving through the courtyard like shadows, tightening belts, whispering prayers. Archaeological findings from ruined fortresses reveal traces of makeshift living spaces built during sieges, wooden huts inside courtyards, ovens made from broken tiles, and fire pits carved into the ground. When the gates closed, the castle became its own small world, sealed against both danger and hope. The air must have been thick with smoke and worry. According to the letters of a monk who witnessed such a siege, Defenders found strange ways to fill their days. They told stories, mended clothes, even played music. He described a young boy who made a flute out of a reed from the moat, his tune echoing faintly through the halls at night. That sound, he wrote, was more haunting than the enemy's drums. One small but revealing fact found in siege accounts is that waste management became an act of strategy. Hidden latrines were built into the outer walls so the smell would not reveal weakness. Buckets of lime were used to mask the odor. You imagine the quiet relief of finding routine in chaos, of turning necessity into order. A curious anecdote from a castle in Gascony tells of defenders who dropped beehives on attackers scaling the walls. It sounds almost humorous, but it was recorded with pride. Nature, when properly provoked, became a weapon. Another story mentions boiling sand poured through narrow holes, preferred over oil because it could seep into armor joints and burn slowly. The ingenuity of desperation leaves its own kind of respect. Some experts continue to debate whether sieges truly tested courage or simply endurance. There were few glorious battles here, only long hunger and longer nights. Chroniclers describe people sleeping fully dressed, weapons within reach, prayers muttered under breath before sleep. Yet amid all this vigilance, moments of normal life persisted. Children still played with sticks, couples still stole quiet glances. Humanity refused to vanish, even in fear. You walk slowly along the inner wall. The stones under your hands feel rougher here, patched and scarred from repairs. You stop near a small window slit and peer out into the open darkness beyond the moat. Imagine the sight centuries ago. Enemy campfires glowing like scattered stars, tents moving faintly in the wind, distant drums marking the passage of time. Inside, people listened to that rhythm and waited. Waiting was its own battle. One chronicler wrote that time itself became an enemy during siege. The longer it stretched, the louder every small sound seemed. The creak of a gate hinge, the cough of a sentry, even the scratch of a mouse could make hearts race. Sleep came in fragments, haunted by dreams of fire and collapse. A curious physical reminder of such anxiety survives in many keeps. Deep grooves worn into stair rails and doorposts where hands gripped them too tightly, too often. Fear leaves marks not only on memory but on stone. You run your fingers along one of these grooves and feel the echo of that tension. Sometimes, of course, no attack ever came. There are accounts of castles preparing for months, stockpiling, arming, watching the horizon only for the enemy to march away. Relief and disappointment mingled strangely then. Soldiers who had sharpened swords in anticipation found themselves restless, their courage unused. The stillness after unspent fear can feel heavier than battle. A single recorded incident tells of a castle whose defenders, after waiting half a year for a siege that never arrived, celebrated with a mock battle inside the walls. They split into teams, using wooden shields and laughter as weapons. It sounds absurd, but it was their way of shaking off the silence. You can almost hear the echo of their shouts in the air around you now. Some historians still argue about whether castles were truly defensive structures or simply symbols of authority, built more for presence than practicality. Perhaps both ideas hold truth. A castle defended its people not only with walls but with belief, the belief that safety could be built from stone and courage combined. You move toward the main gate again, the path lit only by moonlight. The stones seem to glow faintly, silvered with age. You think of the defenders who once stood here, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for signs of movement, their breath mingled with the wind, their hearts steady in the stillness. The torch in your hand flickers, throwing long shadows across the wall. The sound of the wind deepens, like a sigh passing through history itself. The siege is long over, but its silence remains, echoing in the calm night. You turn toward a narrow passage that leads deeper into the keep. Somewhere behind these walls, hidden staircases and secret tunnels twist through the dark, built for moments when escape was the only victory left. You follow that darkness, curious to see where it leads, toward hidden doors and the whisper of the castle's most private secrets. You step into the narrow passage and feel the air change around you. It is cooler here, almost damp, with the faint smell of stone dust and age. The corridor winds sharply, and your torchlight catches irregular seams in the wall, lines that do not quite match the rest of the masonry. You are walking beside secrets, the castle's hidden arteries. According to architectural surveys of medieval fortresses, most large castles contained at least one concealed passage. Some were built for escape, others for movement between private chambers, and a few for spying. Their existence was rarely recorded in writing. Knowledge of them was passed only through trusted hands, the lord, the architect, and perhaps one or two guards. Secrecy was as vital as the walls themselves. You brush your fingers along the cold stone until they meet a faint groove. The pattern forms a rectangle, almost invisible in the dim light. When you push gently, the wall gives slightly under your hand. A whisper of air seeps through the gap, carrying the scent of earth and distance. A hidden door. The torchlight trembles as if caught between curiosity and caution. One detailed account from a Norman castle describes such a passage leading from the great hall to a nearby chapel. It allowed nobles to move unseen during political unrest. Some of these tunnels were no wider than a coffin, and their ceilings so low that even the smallest person had to stoop. You imagine walking through that narrow dark with nothing but a single candle and the sound of your own heartbeat. A curious discovery during excavations in a ruined fortress revealed a passage that opened behind a fireplace. The soot on the stones disguised the entrance for centuries. The archaeologists who found it reported that it still smelled faintly of smoke, as if the last person who escaped through it had only just gone. Some scholars continue to question how often these tunnels were actually used. Many were impractical or dangerous, collapsing after a few meters. Yet their existence had psychological power. To know there was a way out gave hope to those trapped inside. To an attacker, the idea of hidden movement inside a fortress must have been terrifying. The castle itself seemed alive, capable of vanishing and reappearing at will. You take a slow breath and step through the hidden doorway. The air grows cooler, the smell of damp soil stronger. The passage slopes downward, its walls rough and unpolished. Drops of water cling to the ceiling like tiny stars. You move carefully, listening to the faint echo of each footstep. The sound folds back on itself, confusing direction. Time feels strange here. According to a surviving note in a medieval builder's ledger, workers were often sworn to secrecy with blessings and oaths before constructing such tunnels. Breaking that vow could result in banishment or worse. The secrecy was considered sacred, a kind of holy silence surrounding the act of making an invisible path. One odd yet touching story appears in a 16th century retelling of an older legend. It tells of a young mason who fell in love with the Lord's daughter while building a secret staircase. He carved a tiny symbol, a rose, into one of the steps as a memory of her. Centuries later, restorers found a small carving of a flower hidden deep beneath layers of dust. Perhaps the story was not entirely fiction. You pause to rest your torch on a stone ledge and listen. Somewhere far ahead, a faint drip echoes like a heartbeat. You imagine the people who might have passed this way before. A fleeing noble clutching a child, a messenger carrying stolen letters, or perhaps a servant escaping punishment. Every stone carries a trace of panic, of hurried breathing, of hope. A few steps farther, you reach a fork. One path continues deeper into shadow, while the other slopes upward toward a faint shimmer of light. You follow the light, cautious and curious. The tunnel narrows until you must turn sideways to continue. Your shoulder brushes against the wall, and the grit of old mortar presses into your sleeve. When you finally emerge, it is through a small opening, hidden behind a vine-covered arch near the outer courtyard. You blink in surprise at the sudden coolness of open air. The night has deepened, stars scattered like white dust above the towers. You realize you have just traveled the length of the keep unseen, passing through the veins of stone like a whisper. Some experts still debate the purpose of these passages: escape, espionage, or romance. There are recorded stories of lovers meeting in such hidden spaces, their footsteps muffled by earth and secrecy. It seems fitting that the same tunnels that saved lives also hid moments of forbidden tenderness. You step aside to examine the ivy-covered entrance. The opening looks like nothing more than a crack in the wall. To anyone outside, it would disappear into shadow. You imagine the relief of reaching it in time, of feeling the first breath of night air after hours trapped in darkness. Freedom would have tasted like this: cold, sharp, and sweet. The torch burns low now, its flame sputtering in the breeze. You hold it close and take one last glance into the darkness behind you. The passage feels watchful, as if aware that its secrets have been noticed once more. Then you turn toward the open courtyard. The wind picks up, carrying the smell of damp stone and rain. Ahead, carved symbols glimmer faintly on the lintels and window arches, strange marks that look like letters or charms. These are the castle's oldest protectors, signs drawn against forces that no wall could hold. You walk toward them, ready to see how faith and fear lived side by side in the heart of the medieval mind. You cross the courtyard again and stop beneath an archway, where strange shapes glint faintly in the stone. The symbols are everywhere once you notice them: tiny carvings beside doors, above windows, even beneath the eaves. Some are circles, others spirals, stars, or simple crosses. The wind sighs softly through the cracks, as if whispering old words you can almost understand. According to studies of medieval superstition, these marks were not decoration, they were protection. Builders carved them to guard against lightning, sickness, or spirits thought to slip through unseen openings. Every symbol had a purpose, a silent prayer folded into stone. The medieval world saw danger not just in armies or storms, but in invisible forces that traveled with the night. You reach out and touch one of the carvings. The groove is shallow but deliberate, smooth from centuries of fingertips repeating the same gesture. In that motion, fear becomes habit and habit becomes faith. A chronicle from a Yorkshire manor records that masons often cut the first cross before laying the foundation stone, asking heaven to watch over the labourers and the structure alike. One curious note appears in a scribe's marginalia from the late 13th century. He wrote that the letter V scratched above a door stood for Virgo Maria, a call to the Virgin to keep misfortune away. Over time, the letter merged into overlapping shapes that looked like flowers. Visitors centuries later assumed they were mere ornament, never realizing they were blessings disguised as beauty. Some experts continue to debate whether certain symbols were Christian prayers or remnants of older, pre-Christian rites. Spiral patterns, for instance, have appeared in fortresses and temples alike. Perhaps they were simply carried forward from memory, an unbroken thread from the ancient world into the Middle Ages. People may have forgotten their meaning, but not their comfort. You move along the wall, your torchlight revealing faint outlines of runes that look almost like waves. These were sometimes called daisy wheels or hex foils. They were drawn near hearths, stables, or sleeping chambers to confuse wandering spirits. It was said that evil followed straight lines, so the endless circle trapped it forever. You imagine a mother carving such a mark above her child's bed, trusting geometry more than sword or sermon. A delightful but strange record from a Flemish household mentions that some families hung dried herbs in the same pattern as the wall carvings, weaving rosemary and thyme into circular bundles. The fragrance was believed to strengthen the symbol's power, scent itself acting as a guardian. You close your eyes for a moment and can almost smell it, sharp and clean in the cool night air. According to travelers' accounts, charms against bad luck often blended with everyday life. People sewed tiny bells into clothing, tied bits of ribbon around candle holders, or hid small bones in corners of rooms. The castle may have looked invincible from afar, but inside its walls people relied as much on whispers and ritual as on stone and iron. One fragment of folklore recorded in a French abbey tells that before a storm, servants would mark an X on the kitchen door using the soot from the hearth. They believed it kept lightning from striking. Whether it worked or not, the gesture offered reassurance. The simple act of doing something gave courage, when the wind began to howl. You glance up toward the tower where an iron horseshoe still hangs above a window. That tradition too began in this era. Iron was thought to repel spirits, and the shape of the shoe, a crescent, was tied to the moon's protection. Time has worn it thin, but its purpose remains. A curious discovery made during restoration at an English keep revealed a collection of charms hidden within the masonry. A child's shoe, a broken comb, and the bones of a small bird wrapped in linen. Each item, according to the builders, was meant to distract evil that might enter the walls. Historians still debate whether these were religious offerings or fragments of folklore too stubborn to die. Whatever their origin, they speak of fear transformed into creativity. You pause by a window and look out at the dark fields. The world beyond feels distant, almost unreal, but inside this circle of stone you sense the heartbeat of human hope. Every mark and charm was an attempt to make the unseen world a little safer, to believe that mystery could be shaped by touch. In one old sermon, a monk wrote that superstition was the child of fear and imagination. Yet even he admitted that fear itself was proof of faith, the belief that something larger listened, even if it never answered. Perhaps that is what these carvings meant all along. Not certainty, but the desire for it. The torch flickers against the wall and catches the last carving. A small sunburst cut above a doorway. The rays spread outward like a quiet smile. You step beneath it, feeling a strange warmth despite the cold. Behind you, the shadows seem softer now, as if pacified by attention. Ahead, the faint sound of music drifts through the hallways. A lute's slow rhythm mixes with low voices humming a familiar tune. The castle's faith in symbols fades into faith in sound, and the night begins to vibrate gently with melody. You follow that sound toward the great stairway, where harmony waits to replace silence. You follow the sound of music through a narrow corridor that opens into a small hall. The air feels lighter here, touched by warmth and rhythm. You pause in the doorway, letting your ears adjust. A lute plucks softly, joined by the faint hum of a voice that could be centuries old. The melody drifts through the air like candle smoke, curling around pillars and tapestries. According to surviving manuscripts of courtly life, music filled nearly every corner of medieval castles. It was not just for feasts or festivals, but a part of daily rhythm. A psalm might accompany dawn, a dance after supper, a quiet song to soften long nights. Music bridged the gap between the sacred and the ordinary. Its echoes could lift a fortress from gloom to grace. You walk farther into the hall, and the acoustics immediately embrace you. The stone carries sound in ripples, turning a single note into something endless. Builders understood this, whether consciously or by instinct. A well-placed arch could make even the simplest voice seem angelic. Chroniclers of the 12th century mention that some halls were designed specifically for song, their dimensions set not by numbers but by listening. One well-known fact preserved in abbey records reveals that many castle musicians were trained in monasteries before entering noble service. They carried with them fragments of sacred melodies, weaving them into secular tunes. The blend of divine and earthly themes gave medieval music its haunting tone, half prayer, half memory. A charming but lesser-known note in a troubadour's diary tells of musicians tuning their instruments by candlelight, using the flicker of the flame to match vibrations. The practice seems poetic, though entirely practical. You can almost picture it, a player bending close to the flame, plucking gently, the soft note merging with the light itself. Some experts continue to discuss whether music in castles was primarily entertainment or emotional necessity. For many, it was both. Sound softened the severity of stone. In long winters, when darkness lingered for months, a familiar song could warm the spirit better than any fire. You find a stool near the hearth and sit, listening. The melody shifts into something slower, almost mournful. This would have been the hour for reflective songs, the kind sung by travelling minstrels who carried news between courts. Their verses told of wars, love, miracles, and loss. Every listener found something of themselves within those lines. A curious entry in a Scottish household record mentions that lords often paid musicians not in gold but in cloth or food, symbols of gratitude that kept them travelling from castle to castle. These wanderers were both artists and informants, carrying stories in rhythm. The same song might sound slightly different in every region, shaped by accent and memory. You close your eyes and let the imagined instruments take shape around you. The low hum of a viol, the bright trill of a flute, the pulse of a drum. Together they weave a tapestry of sound, more alive than silence but gentler than speech. The rhythm matches the slow flicker of the fire, each note a reminder that time, too, has music. According to illuminated manuscripts of minstrelsy, performers often played with deliberate imperfection, leaving spaces between notes to let the hall breathe. It was said that true beauty lay in the pause, the small silence between sounds. You feel that truth settling over you now as the tune fades into stillness. A curious story from a Spanish court tells of a young musician who played so softly one evening that guests began to fall asleep at the table. The chronicler wrote that it was not boredom but peace that overcame them, as if the notes carried a charm for rest. You smile, wondering if he would have fit perfectly into this moment. The castle's connection to music was also practical. Trumpets signaled curfews, bells marked prayers, drums announced arrivals. Even danger had its own melody. To live in a medieval fortress was to live inside a symphony of sound, each note tied to survival and ceremony alike. Some historians believe that music created a sense of unity impossible through words. A hall filled with people listening together was, for a moment, equal. Rank faded beneath rhythm. You can almost see it now. The lord, the servant, the cook, all still for the same refrain. The last note lingers like breath against the wall. The silence afterward feels full rather than empty, a gentle ache that asks to be remembered. You rise slowly, your footsteps soft against the flagstones. Somewhere above, a faint cheer breaks the stillness, followed by laughter and the clatter of wood. The sound of revelry filters down from the courtyard. The night of peace has turned into celebration. Perhaps a tournament has ended, or a guest has arrived. Either way, the castle stirs again, waking from its lullaby. You turn toward the stairs leading upward. The flicker of torches dances along the walls, guiding you to the source of the noise. As you climb, the air grows warmer, scented faintly with sweat, wine, and excitement. The great doors ahead swing open to reveal the open yard once more, alive with colour, motion, and spectacle. The world of tournaments and pageantry unfolds before you, glittering in the torchlight. You step into the courtyard, and the world bursts into motion. The night has given way to bright torches that throw flickering gold across banners, shields, and the polished steel of helmets. Trumpets call from the ramparts, and laughter rolls like warm thunder. The castle that once felt so solemn now hums with celebration. Tournaments and spectacles were the heartbeat of medieval joy, moments when even the stone walls seemed to lean in to watch. According to royal accounts, tournaments were both sport and strategy. They displayed strength, wealth, and unity, but they also disguised politics beneath the shimmer of chivalry. Knights competed for honor, yes, but also for alliances, wagers, and the glances of noble spectators. Each tilt of a lance or clash of armor carried meaning far beyond the field. You make your way through the gathered crowd. Servants hurry past carrying jugs of ale, their faces flushed from heat and excitement. Children sit on shoulders to see better. In the distance, two riders prepare for the joust, their horses stamping restlessly, plumes shaking like the breath of dragons. The smell of sweat, hay, and trampled earth fills the air. You feel your pulse quicken despite knowing this is only memory now. A chronicler from the 12th century described tournaments as half prayer, half chaos. They began with solemn blessings and ended with bruises, splintered lances, and laughter. Knights swore to fight for honor, but a bit of showmanship never hurt. Some were known to wear sleeves embroidered with a lady's colors, their courage tied to silk and sentiment. One charming account from Burgundy mentions a knight who carried his lady's ribbon on his helmet for 7 years without washing it, insisting that its luck would fade with soap. His comrades joked that victory came from the smell, not the devotion. Such stories capture the strange blend of seriousness and humor that colored these events. Archaeological evidence from tournament fields shows that not all contests were violent. Many were rehearsed performances. Wooden swords, blunted lances, and mock duels gave spectators a thrill without drawing blood. Yet accidents were common. A broken lance could pierce armor, and cheers could turn to cries in an instant. Danger was part of the spectacle, a reminder that courage was always rented from fate. Some experts continue to debate whether these gatherings were genuine training for war or elaborate theatre. Perhaps they were both. The rhythm of hooves, the clang of armor, the rising chant of the crowd all echoed the patterns of real battle, but with applause replacing screams. For a moment, knights could taste glory without the shadow of death. You find a place along the edge of the tilt yard, where the earth is packed hard from centuries of hooves. The joust begins. 2 horses surge forward, each rider lowering his lance. The impact is sudden, explosive. A crack of wood, a shower of dust, the crowd's roar. One rider wavers, steadies, then raises his arm in salute. The tension breaks into cheers. It feels alive again, this old dream of valor. As the next competitors ready themselves, musicians play along the sidelines. Drums keep time, pipes spiral upward in melody, and banners ripple like living fire. The castle becomes a stage, each sound another brushstroke on its great performance. A curious note found in a steward's expense book reveals that after tournaments, the grounds often turned into markets. Merchants set up stalls selling ribbons, charms, and trinkets shaped like tiny shields. Children traded pebbles for souvenirs, and the smell of roasted meat replaced that of dust and sweat. It was a rare moment when peasants and nobles shared the same laughter, even if only for a few hours. As night deepens, the spectacle continues indoors. You follow the crowd back through the archway into the great hall, where torches blaze and tables overflow. Music swells again, louder and faster now. The same knights who clashed in armor now dance with unsteady grace, still flushed from wine and victory. One poetic observation from a court musician noted that these feasts were the other half of battle. The triumph of surviving deserved its own ritual, and celebration was a kind of renewal. You can see it clearly here, the joy, the exhaustion, the relief that tomorrow's duties are still a sunrise away. You sit near the edge of the hall, watching servants move like a well-practiced tide. Platters of meat pass by, cups refill, and the smell of roasted herbs and honey drifts through the air. For a moment, the castle feels almost modern in its rhythm, a space made for spectacle and connection. Some historians have suggested that tournaments were less about combat and more about control. By keeping knights busy with games, rulers channeled their aggression into ceremony instead of rebellion. It was a clever kind of peace, disguised as sport. The idea makes you smile, a kingdom distracted by pageantry rather than war. The music slows. A bard steps forward, lute in hand, and begins to sing. His voice rises above the murmurs, telling a story of a castle that survived 1,000 storms, of lovers parting and reuniting, of kings forgotten, and walls that endure. You recognize the pattern now. It is the story of every castle, every night like this one. When the song ends, the crowd claps softly, almost reverently. The fire pops in the hearth, sending a spark upward like a fleeting star. Outside, the trumpets fall silent. The games are over, the laughter fading into satisfied sighs. You rise quietly and step away from the hall. The noise behind you softens until only the crackle of distant torches remains. Ahead, the corridor leads downward into cooler air again. Somewhere below, the sound of dripping water and clinking coins hints at another truth of castle life, the unromantic work of trade, treasure, and taxation. The glitter of gold waits in the dark. You follow the slope of the corridor downward, until the sounds of music and laughter vanish completely. The air grows heavier, damp, with the scent of earth and metal. A faint flicker of torchlight glints off something dull and grey along the wall. You realize you have stepped into the underbelly of the castle, the place where wealth was counted and guarded, where the pulse of commerce kept the fortress alive. According to royal household records, every major castle functioned as a center of local trade. Within its walls were storerooms, granaries and treasuries that managed more than silver. Grain, salt, and cloth were forms of currency too, traded for loyalty and labor. The castle was not just a fortress of stone, but a fortress of economics, the spine of medieval survival. You pause beside a small wooden door reinforced with iron bands. The lock is massive, its surface rusted with age. Inside, you can almost picture shelves stacked high with ledgers, sacks of flour, barrels of ale, and chests filled with coins sealed in wax. A steward would once have stood here, keys jangling at his belt, his quill scratching long into the night. One well-documented record from the accounts of Henry II details payments for everything from candles to cannon shot, revealing how castles breathed through spending. To run a fortress required constant motion, taxes collected, rents exchanged, tolls gathered at the gate. The Lords of Stone were, in truth, masters of numbers. A curious discovery during excavations in a French stronghold uncovered hundreds of small lead tokens, each stamped with symbols of bread or tools. They served as a kind of internal currency, exchanged among servants before being tallied by the steward. It was an ingenious system, a miniature economy hidden within walls. According to merchants' letters of the period, castles also acted as banks for their regions. Wealthy travelers stored valuables here, protected by reputation and stone. The promise of safety gave castles a kind of financial gravity. To have your chest stored in a lord's treasury was to announce your importance without saying a word. Some scholars still debate whether this concentration of wealth strengthened feudalism or suffocated it. Money flowed upward like water to the keep, but rarely trickled back down. Yet the people who served within the walls often found stability unknown in villages beyond. Their wages, though small, arrived with regularity, and their lives revolved around the rhythms of paydays and provisions. You walk deeper into the cellar, your torch reflecting faintly on coins embedded in cracks of stone. Perhaps they were dropped centuries ago, their owners long gone. You stoop to pick one up, its surface rough with corrosion. The faint outline of a cross remains, a reminder that even money was sacred once, its image blessed to ensure honest exchange. According to records of toll collectors, every cart entering the castle was inspected and taxed. Grain, cloth, even salt paid its tithe to pass through the gates. The revenue kept the walls standing, the soldiers fed, the masons paid. It was an endless circle of debt and labor, balanced by faith in structure. A small but intriguing detail found in a steward's personal diary mentions the use of coded language in ledgers. Certain debts were written under nicknames or drawn as symbols: a loaf for a bribe, a dove for a favor. The system was subtle enough that only insiders could read it. Corruption, it seems, has always preferred the company of clever minds. The torchlight dances across another section of the wall, illuminating carved niches where documents were once stored in wooden chests. The smell of wax and parchment still lingers faintly, dry and sweet. You can almost hear the rustle of paper, the steady scratch of quills counting each coin, each bushel, each promise. Some historians have noted that stewards and clerks often wielded more real influence than soldiers. Numbers carried power of their own. A single line on a page could decide who starved and who prospered. In many ways, the castle's true weapon was ink. You reach the end of the corridor, where a small arch opens into another chamber. Inside, the ceiling is low and arched, built for security rather than comfort. This was the strong room. Chests once lined the floor here, sealed with wax and guarded day and night. The treasure was both literal and symbolic, the proof of authority that kept loyalty intact. A curious anecdote in a merchant's letter describes a time when a castle lord, desperate to fund a campaign, melted his silver tableware into coins. The gesture impressed his soldiers more than any speech could. It showed that even nobility could bleed metal when needed. The torch wavers as a draft moves through the chamber. For a moment, the light makes the walls shimmer as if gold still gleams beneath the surface. It is easy to imagine the hum of activity that once filled this place. The counting, the arguing, the quiet sighs of clerks balancing columns by candlelight. Then the silence returns, steady and deep. You realize that every sound of life above the laughter, the music, the tournaments was sustained by the patient labor of those who worked in this shadowed world. The glamour of the castle stood on the shoulders of ink-stained hands. You take one last look around the cellar. The faint smell of iron mingles with the cool air, and a single droplet falls from the ceiling into a crack below. It is a small sound, yet it seems to echo the rhythm of all those long-ago transactions. As you climb back toward the light, you feel the change in the air again. The passage leads toward colder stone, toward places where money meant little. The treasury gives way to the cells, where fate balanced itself in chains and mercy. You follow the sound of dripping water and the slow thud of your own steps into the darkness below, where prisoners and promises once shared the same walls. The air cools as you descend, growing thick with the smell of damp stone and rusted iron. The faint drip of water becomes your only companion. The torch in your hand sputters softly, its light trembling against the walls. You have entered the castle's deepest chambers, the place where justice, punishment, and patience lived side by side. The stones here do not echo celebration. They hold their breath. According to judicial records preserved from several medieval estates, most castles contained at least one prison, often beneath the Great Hall or near the gatehouse. These cells were not always for common criminals. Many held political prisoners, hostages, and unlucky nobles who had fallen out of favor. The rooms were rarely large, their ceilings low, their air heavy. To be locked here meant to vanish from the world above. You move through a narrow corridor lined with small arched openings. Inside each is a chamber just wide enough for a straw bed and a bucket. The air smells of dust, lime, and time itself. In one cell, the wall bears a carving of a simple cross. The lines are uneven, scraped by someone desperate for grace, a reminder that even hope can survive in the darkest corner. According to the writings of a Benedictine chronicler, prisoners were sometimes granted a candle on holy days. He described the moment as both mercy and torment, the flicker of light reminding them of the world they could not see. You look at the small shelf cut into the wall before you and imagine that lonely flame, its smoke curling like a prayer no one answered. A curious discovery in a ruined castle dungeon revealed traces of ink on the plaster walls, faint marks that turned out to be Latin words. Scholars believe a captive cleric wrote fragments of psalms from memory, mixing them with personal thoughts. His final line, barely legible, reads, "I forgive the silence." The words linger like breath, patient and defiant. Some historians continue to debate how often these dungeons were used. Not all castles employed torture or long confinement. In many cases, imprisonment was symbolic, a pause between accusation and ransom. A noble enemy was more valuable alive than dead, a bargaining chip in the endless game of allegiance. You step farther into the passage, where the air feels colder still. The sound of dripping water grows louder, echoing against stone. The torchlight reveals iron rings set into the walls, their surfaces crusted with rust. These were once anchors for chains or ropes. You run your fingers along one and feel the chill of metal long unused. For a moment, it feels as if the castle itself still remembers who once stood here. A small but poignant detail survives in the diary of a travelling friar who visited a prisoner during Lent. He described singing hymns through the keyhole, so the captive could join from within. The image softens the idea of cruelty. Even in confinement, compassion managed to slip through cracks like light. The damp floor beneath your feet glistens faintly. A rat scurries past, disappearing into a crevice. The world down here belongs to shadows and whispers. Yet even in this silence, traces of humanity endure. Someone carved tally marks into the stone near the doorway. 37. Perhaps days. Perhaps something else entirely. According to castle inventories, prisoners were sometimes fed from the same kitchens that served the lord's table, though their portions were smaller and often stale. Still, the act carried symbolic weight. The same bread that fed power also fed powerlessness. You find that symmetry oddly beautiful. A curious story passed down through local folklore tells of a prisoner who escaped by hiding inside a barrel of wine meant for the lord's cellar. When the barrel was rolled through the gate, the man slipped free and vanished into the woods. No record confirms it, yet the tale persists, carried by generations who found delight in cleverness surviving cruelty. Some scholars remain divided over whether castles used their prisons as tools of fear or as measures of justice. Perhaps they were both. In a world built on hierarchy, to lose freedom was to lose identity. The castle did not need to punish with pain. Its silence was punishment enough. You pause by the final cell. Its door has rotted away, leaving only a frame of iron hinges. Inside, the air is still. You step across the threshold and hold your torch high. The walls here are covered in faint scratches, countless overlapping marks like waves. You cannot tell if they are words or simply the restless traces of hands that refuse to be still. Either way, they speak of endurance. Standing here, you understand something quiet about castles. They were not just homes for power or sanctuaries from war. They were mirrors of the human heart, strong, proud, but filled with rooms no light could reach. You turn to leave, and as you do, the echo of your footsteps fills the corridor. The torch flame bends in the draught, guiding you back toward the stairway. The walls seem to exhale softly as you pass, as though relieved that your visit is over. When you climb back into the open air, the night feels new again. The sky above the courtyard glows faintly with stars. Somewhere behind you, the darkness still keeps its secrets, but ahead, another kind of shadow waits. The ones made not by stone or fear, but by imagination itself. The stories of ghosts and legends begin where history falls silent. You stand once again in the courtyard, breathing in the cold air that tastes faintly of rain. The castle is quiet now, but a different kind of life stirs within its silence. The torches burn low, their flames moving like sighs, and every shadow seems to shift just a little when you are not looking. This is the hour when stories begin to wake, the hour that belongs to ghosts, legends, and the soft imagination of night. According to local chronicles and travelers' accounts, nearly every castle in Europe claims its own ghost. They appear in countless forms: a pale lady gliding along parapets, a knight forever pacing the battlements, a monk crossing a courtyard where the chapel once stood. People have whispered about them for centuries, shaping fear into fascination. You realize that such stories are less about death and more about memory refusing to leave. You walk toward the great staircase, its steps glistening slightly with dew. The stones feel colder than before, as if touched by invisible hands. Somewhere above, the wind moves through a broken window, producing a faint moaning sound. In daylight, it would be nothing more than air. At night, it sounds like a sigh. According to a 15th century letter written by a visiting poet, one of the oldest ghost tales tells of a builder who fell from the wall before the castle was completed. His spirit, they said, returned each night to tap the stones, checking that the structure still held. Guards reported hearing the sound of hammering long after midnight, though no one ever saw him. The poet ended his letter with a simple thought: perhaps he only wanted to be sure his work was loved. A curious local tradition from certain regions records that household servants would greet unseen presences politely before locking up for the night. "Good rest to you," they whispered to the empty hall, a kind of truce between living and memory. You smile at the thought that courtesy extended even to ghosts. Some scholars still discuss whether these hauntings were born of fear, guilt, or simply the echo of imagination in cold stone. Castles amplified every sound, the creak of wood, the drip of water, the distant cry of an owl. In the hush of midnight, the mind shaped these noises into stories. The result was folklore that comforted as much as it frightened. You step into the great hall again. The fire has burned to embers, the smell of smoke hanging low and sweet. For a moment, you think you see movement near the far wall, a flicker of pale light where no candle burns. It could be nothing. It could be everything. The line between truth and superstition wavers like a reflection on water. A small but fascinating note survives in a Scottish manuscript, describing how castle guards would mark protective symbols on their armour before night duty. The belief was not that ghosts could harm them, but that fear itself could. By scratching a cross or a simple circle into their shields, they steadied their hearts. Faith, even when mixed with folklore, was still a kind of armour. There are stories of kindness among the hauntings too. In a French fortress, the so-called White Lady was said to appear beside lost children and guide them back to safety before dawn. In another, a monk's shadow was seen lighting the chapel candles during storms. These tales suggest that people wanted to believe the past could still care for the present. According to later legends collected by folklorists, ghost stories served another purpose. They kept history alive. Each haunting anchored memory to place. A castle with no ghost, one writer joked, was merely a pile of stone without imagination. You glance around and think he might have been right. A curious discovery made during restoration of a ruined keep revealed fragments of parchment stuffed into cracks in the wall. They contained prayers for the dead written by servants centuries ago. Perhaps the legends began as acts of compassion, tiny gestures meant to give the forgotten a name again. Some experts continue to question why ghost tales have such endurance. Perhaps they exist because castles invite them. Their long corridors, their silence, their persistence through time all create a stage for memory to perform. Each generation adds another verse to the song, another shadow to the wall. You stand by the window and look out at the night. Mist gathers over the moat, turning the landscape into a silver sea. A faint ripple moves across it, though there is no breeze. You tell yourself it is only the water, yet a small part of you feels that the castle is still awake, listening. It occurs to you that ghosts might not be spirits at all, but echoes of emotions too strong to fade. Love, regret, longing, fear, these linger in places that have held them too long. A castle becomes a vessel of those feelings, replaying them like a song only the night can hear. The wind shifts, carrying a faint murmur through the hall. For an instant, you think you hear footsteps in the corridor behind you. When you turn, there is only silence. You laugh quietly, half at yourself, half at the power of the moment. Perhaps belief is its own kind of haunting. You take a deep breath and let the quiet settle again. The ghosts, if they exist, mean no harm. They are simply the castle's memories refusing to grow cold. You whisper a soft farewell to the shadows and step back into the courtyard. The mist has thickened now, wrapping the walls in silver. Somewhere in that haze lies the next story waiting to unfold. How castles crumble, how they pass from strength to ruin, and how beauty can survive even in decay. You walk toward the fading torchlight, ready to see what remains when time finally takes back what it once built. You pass through the mist-covered courtyard where the sound of your footsteps fades almost immediately. The moonlight seems softer now, reflecting on broken stone and patches of wild grass. The air carries the scent of wet earth and ivy, and the once proud walls around you lean gently toward ruin. This is the final stage of every fortress, the slow surrender to time. According to early romantic travel writings, the fascination with castle ruins began long after their power had vanished. Poets and painters from the 18th and 19th centuries saw in these crumbling towers something noble, a beauty born from decay. They walked through overgrown courtyards like this one, and felt what they called sweet melancholy. You can feel it too, the mix of sadness and peace that only old places seem to hold. You walk beneath an arch where chunks of mortar hang loose like brittle lace. Moss has crept across the stones, softening every sharp edge. Nature, patient and gentle, reclaims what ambition built. Archaeologists who studied such ruins note that ivy does more than decorate. It weaves itself through cracks, holding stones together even as it consumes them. Destruction and preservation walk hand in hand. A curious detail appears in a survey of castle ruins in Wales. Explorers found small altars, built centuries after abandonment, likely by local villagers. They left coins, flowers, and bits of fabric offerings not to gods but to memory. The ruins had become sacred again, not for power, but for endurance. Some historians continue to debate whether the people who first saw their castles fall viewed them as losses or as relics, perhaps both. To see your home become a ruin is to watch time draw a line between what was and what remains. Yet those who stayed behind, tending gardens among the rubble, must have found a quiet comfort in what endured. You pause near a broken window frame, its tracery still elegant, though much of the glass is gone. The wind moves through the opening with a low hum, almost like a voice. It speaks of centuries collapsing into one another, of lives layered so tightly that they can no longer be separated. Each ruined castle is not a monument to defeat, but to survival. One diary from a 19th century traveller describes sleeping inside such a ruin, his fire flickering beneath a collapsed arch. He wrote that the night felt strangely safe, as if the stones remembered their duty to shelter. He awoke at dawn to the sound of birds nesting in the cracks and wrote, "Even in ruin, the castle keeps watch." You kneel beside a fallen block carved with what was once part of a coat of arms. The details have faded, the edges softened, but you can still see the faint outline of a lion's paw. Symbols like this once carried lineage and pride. Now they rest quietly in the soil. There is humility in that transformation. A small but lovely custom has grown around ruined castles. Visitors leave flowers in the crevices of old walls, not for superstition but for respect. Each blossom is a gesture of gratitude for endurance, a silent acknowledgement that the stones have outlasted everything built to conquer them. According to cultural historians, the modern idea of nostalgia was born in places like this. Ruins remind us that beauty and impermanence can coexist. The decay invites reflection, not mourning. The castle does not die. It changes shape, becoming part of the landscape it once dominated. You walk toward a tower reduced to half its height. Inside, a sapling grows where the hearth once stood, its leaves trembling in the night breeze. The roots have found space between old flagstones, drinking from rain that seeps through the cracks. Life has returned in a quieter form. The smell of the young tree mingles with the cold scent of stone, creating something almost holy. A curious observation recorded by a conservationist notes that bats often choose ruined towers for roosting. Their wings replace the banners that once hung there. The rhythm of their flight at dusk becomes the new anthem of the place. It is easy to imagine that the castle, in its quiet decay, still fulfills its duty of protection this time, for creatures instead of people. You lift your gaze to the broken battlements outlined against the stars. Once, guards stood there to watch for enemies. Now only wind and birds keep vigil. The sky has reclaimed the view. There is a strange comfort in this reversal, as if the earth has finally exhaled after centuries of holding its breath. Some writers describe ruins as frozen music, each fallen wall a lingering note in a melody that never truly ends. You can hear that song now in the rustle of grass, the whisper of air through hollow stones, the slow pulse of time still moving beneath your feet. You linger for a moment longer, tracing the rough surface of the wall beside you. It feels warm from the day's sun, though the night is cold. Perhaps the stones remember heat just as they remember voices. They have learned to keep the echoes of life within them. The torch in your hand burns low again, its flame trembling like the heartbeat of the story itself. Ahead, the path curves gently back toward the main keep, where the ruins rise into the dark like a crown worn thin by years. The castle's story is nearly complete, but its echo still grows softer rather than silent. You walk toward that last echo, ready to rest among its final reflections. You return to the great courtyard once more, now bathed in the faint light of dawn. The mist has thinned, and the sky above the towers glows with pale gold. What was once shadow now softens into detail. The worn steps, the ivy along the walls, the faint outline of old banners long turned to dust. The castle breathes quietly, as if relieved that another night has passed. According to early chroniclers, many castles began their mornings in ritual silence. The first bell would ring from the chapel, its tones spreading through stone and air like a slow awakening. Guards stretched stiff limbs, cooks stirred embers back to flame, and the world began again, unchanged and eternal. You can almost hear it, the gentle clang of iron, the mutter of prayer, the distant sound of hooves beginning their day. You walk toward the gatehouse and pause beneath its arch. The walls rise around you, vast and patient. For centuries, they have witnessed every rhythm of human life. Laughter, hunger, fear, ambition, love. You realize that a castle is not merely a monument of defense. It is a memory carved into the earth, a collection of ordinary moments preserved in extraordinary stone. A record from a medieval stonemasons guild once described their work as teaching rock to remember. The phrase lingers in your mind. It seems true now. Each stone here has remembered. It remembers every storm and celebration, every feast and famine. The echo of those who lived here hums faintly in the air, woven into the mortar itself. A curious little note from an old traveller's diary says that when he stood in a ruined keep at sunrise, he felt the heartbeat of time beneath the feet. You feel it too, a rhythm so faint it might be imagination, but also too steady to ignore. Perhaps that is what castles have always guarded, not treasure or rulers, but the quiet persistence of life itself. Some modern historians like to debate the purpose of castles. Were they fortresses, palaces, prisons, or symbols? Standing here, you realize they were all of those, and something simpler too. They were attempts to make safety visible, to turn human hope into architecture. The dream of permanence, set against the truth of impermanence. The wind moves through the courtyard again, carrying the faint fragrance of rain-soaked grass. A pair of swallows dart above the walls, their wings tracing patterns older than history. For them, the castle is not ruin or relic, only shelter. You watch them circle once, twice, then vanish into the open sky. You climb the last few steps to the wall walk. The view stretches outward, hills fading into haze, a river winding like a silver ribbon, and beyond that, the whisper of forests. Everything feels calm, as if the world itself is exhaling. Below, the courtyard remains still, but not empty. It feels full of stories, of memory, of something ancient and forgiving. A curious legend tells that if you press your ear to an old castle wall at sunrise, you can hear the past breathing softly. You try it. The stone feels cool against your cheek. At first, there is only silence, but then a faint vibration reaches you, like distant voices carried through centuries. It might be the wind, it might be something else. Either way, it feels alive. You step back and let your gaze rest on the towers one last time. Their edges glow in the morning light, golden and gentle, no longer symbols of power but of endurance. Time has not defeated them. It has merely taught them to stand differently. Some philosophers describe history as a mirror that shows what humanity once dared to dream. If that is true, then castles reflect our most enduring dream, to build something that can outlast fear. Even now, their walls remind us that strength does not have to roar. Sometimes it only needs to remain. You take a slow breath, letting the cool morning air fill your lungs. The story feels complete now. The castle has given up its secrets, its fears, its laughter, and its quiet truths. It stands before you not as a ruin but as a teacher. The light spreads across the courtyard, washing the last traces of shadow from the stone. You close your eyes for a moment and let the warmth settle over you. The castle seems to rest too, content to be remembered once more. And so, as dawn rises fully and the world brightens, you turn away from the walls and begin to walk back down the path. Behind you, the fortress stands silent but not asleep, its echo following you like a lullaby carved into the air. The journey through the castle softens now, its sounds fading to a slow hush. The walls that once held armies and kings are quiet again, resting beneath the touch of sunlight. You imagine walking once more through the empty halls, the scent of dust and stone giving way to the freshness of morning. Every echo feels gentle, as if time itself is stretching after a long sleep. Let your mind wander back through what you've seen: the torchlight in the corridors, the laughter in the great hall, the faint melody of a lute drifting through shadows. These moments linger not as facts, but as feelings, soft impressions that settle like mist on calm water. The castle's story was never only about battles or power. It was about endurance, about warmth found within cold walls, kindness hidden between duties, and faith carried quietly through centuries. Its strength lies not in the iron that once guarded it, but in the tenderness that time could not erase. Now the air is still. The last torch has burned out, and only the slow rhythm of your breathing fills the space. The stones around you no longer seem heavy. They feel like company old, patient, and kind. You picture the towers dissolving into cloud, the moat reflecting only sky. Everything returns to calm. The castle remains, not as fortress but as memory, resting gently in the folds of history. Close your eyes. The world outside fades to silence. You are safe, surrounded by time and quiet. The story is over, but its peace continues. Let it carry you into sleep, soft as candlelight fading on stone. Sweet dreams.